Welcome back, everybody, from lunch. I think all our red lines are finally going back up, so we can return to our conversation. Do you have
So,
something?
what I'm saying is that I think the verbiage as is a little problematic, that it needs to kind of be tightened up, ironed out, so that we can navigate it a little bit better. I think everybody kind of agrees that there's places where it definitely seems to say something different in one section than the other section. So I was wondering if as a group we could agree on, maybe not, because I don't have any verbiage, so not verbiage, but how we want this to be structured. And by structured, I mean work for a student, not necessarily the way it's ordered in here. Because once we know how it's going to work for a student, then we can better craft verbiage that follows that trajectory. Does that make sense?
Agreed.
Yes and no, because I'm not sure I can easily say that I concur that all of this language, and I see there's some heads nodding, that it's necessarily confusing or fighting with each other. So I think conversing a little bit more to explain why that appears to be the case, but also I agree to understand, and I have the sense that we're all on the same page on how it should work for students, but I think we should rehash that out as well.
Sure.
So
I guess the first issue that I was trying to reconcile over lunch was at the beginning when we were talking about all of that nice time frame and the way that re-enrolling would work. It was explained that Ed would reset the clock if a student completed prior to the expiration of time allowed for completion of the agreement to serve. So that's one way in which this could all work. But it is written at the top of page 12 that Ed will reset the clock just based on re-enrollment, not completion, that's two very different things.
Well, and I was just going to say, when you say the time, and maybe it's the same question, I don't know, but you said around the time, it sounds like you're talking about the 8-year window, and I'm not even sure that that's necessarily the time that Ed was talking about.
So that's another one of the problems that I think we need to land on, is that when and how will re-enrollment or completion, once we decide which one we're going to be relying on, since it does mention both, how does that come into play with the 8-year window as well as conversion after the 5th year? And we don't know that yet either. So
The way I was operating on this, and I understand it, I may be totally off here, is that all of this functions within the fact that conversion is in the 5th year. If none of this has happened before year 5, you're going to be converted.
okay, so let's say that is true. Yes, that's a yes. What if they are enrolled in a teach eligible program during that 5th year?
Then the clock would be...
Because it says here that they reset it if they're re-enrolled. That's why I think we need to really talk about all. You're highlighting my exact
those
problem.
other rules sort of, if you've already been converted because you've run out of time, then this isn't going to apply because you've already been converted. I don't know that it's really necessary. I mean, we could add some language here to make that explicit, but there's a separate rule that says your grants will be converted, in so many words, if you run out of time to complete the 4 years within the 8-year period. So if you reach that point before you've re-enrolled in school, you may not even be thinking about re-enrolling in school, then it's too late. This doesn't apply. That's what this is intended to do here.
So, if I understand correctly, that doesn't quite address what you're talking about, though, because we're not disputing that if the clock elapses, that the clock wouldn't elapse.
I'm still not sure that I understand, because I think you're saying you think there's something here that's conflicting, and I'm not sure that I understand what you see as conflicting. So let me give you an example here to illustrate this. You
Don't like examples.
You go to school for 2 years and you withdraw before you completed the program. A year goes by and you re-enroll in school. You don't do any teaching during that 1 year. You don't get a suspension. But you re-enroll in another Teach Grant eligible program. say you get another teach grant. Well, that's a separate, we'll deal with the question of whether you have to get another teach grant separately. But say you re-enroll and you get another teach grant program. We will then reset the 8-year clock so that it will begin when you cease enrollment the next time. And so your 8-year period will start then. That's what this language is saying. The 8-year period doesn't start when you re-enroll. It starts when you cease enrollment at that school, which may be the same school you were in before, it may be a different school. It'll start then. That's what this language is saying. And you will have 8 years to complete your 4-year service obligation. That 1 year in between is not going to count against you because we're proposing here to reset the 8-year clock to begin when you cease enrollment at the next time. That's what this is saying.
Okay, so
So then if we view it in the context of the timeline that we drew on the board here, essentially that if you re-enroll at any point up to, let's say hypothetically, the conversion point, then your timeline would be reset. I'm kind of
Yes, if
taking
you
out a lot of details in
re-enroll
there,
at the
but-
same academic level, like in another, if you were an undergraduate, you re-enroll as an undergraduate. If you enroll as a graduate student, that's different because then you have a separate service obligation.
So it maintains a service obligation with the undergraduate versus graduate
Because
level.
the concept is one service obligation for all of your undergraduate teach grant eligible programs and one for your graduate programs. That's the concept here.
okay, so then conversion does trump it, and it doesn't matter when
Yes, if
would
you
complete.
don't, you would have to re-enroll before you've gotten to the point where you've run out of time under, right.
The window, 8-year window, whichever,
It wouldn't be the 8-year window, it would be,
from ceasing enrollment, it would be an 8-year window.
This also assumes that the student doesn't have any qualifying service years in between, and
Yeah.
that may not necessarily be the case for some.
which once again brings up the question of can they have a concurrent period of earning years or?
That comes a
Later.
couple of paragraphs down, too. We talk about that, because there could be situations, probably, if someone is in a teach grant eligible master, they already have a bachelor's degree, so they already have a teaching certificate, where you could withdraw from a master's degree program, get a job as a teacher, teach for a couple of years, and then go return to that master's degree program. We cover that
So-
in
right,
another
so-
purpose. Right, yeah.
A person would simply just have to re-enroll prior to conversion? Or would they have to begin service prior to conversion to prevent conversion?
Well,
Re-enroll, I think.
I think, yeah.
It's
in this
re-enroll.
context, we're talking about re-enrolling. The idea is,
So they've proposed a less rigorous standard than what you were initially proposing, that they would have to re-enroll and complete the program within the original 8 years. What they're saying is, as long as you
Just
re-enroll
re-enrolling.
prior to conversion,
Right, which is different than
We'll
what we
delay
talked
it.
about this morning, which
Yeah,
is why
it
it was
is.
competing. So,
it is. I don't necessarily, I tend to agree, yeah,
Yeah.
that this
better
is,
too,
yeah.
because
mhm.
as, sorry, Deb, remind yourself, that as students, that student can still, that gives them longer if they need it, something else comes up, or they have to drop to part-time or different things, which you can still do in teach grant programs and be safe. if
you know, the alternative would be to do something like you're in school for a year and you withdraw, your 8-year period starts. A year later, you go back, return to that same program or maybe a different program, undergraduate, get another teach grant program, well, then you'd have another 8-year service obligation for that. That would be, but we didn't think that was very
Too much.
Consolidating.
friendly
Yeah.
to teach grant recipients. It seems,
Consolidating. That makes sense.
Yeah, this is, again, this is just different than what we talked about. So essentially, a student who was enrolled in a teach grant eligible program could never be converted.
not during the pendency of their enrollment
No.
in the program.
Right.
Yes,
you know,
that is true.
yeah, you don't get converted while you're in the program, but if you're gonna take some time off before you go back to school, you need to do it unless you've gotten a suspension for some other reason. you need to do it
Prior to
before
the
you
normal
get to the
conversion
point where you'd be
that's helpful.
converted into the normal conversion. Right. That's what we're saying.
So all we're imposing is that there's a time limit by which you have to re-enroll if you have completed no service.
Yeah,
That's
we,
it.
I mean, we could, I think it's implicit in these regulations that we have a separate conversion regulation that says your grants are going to be converted if this happens. We can talk about maybe adding something here to make it a little clearer that you have to, that this assumes you re-enroll before you get to that point.
Yeah, I think the language, if we could clear it up, even if, though it's in a different section, to add that language would be helpful in making sure that people don't misinterpret, or when they're looking at just certain parts of the regulations, they don't get confused later on when something else occurs.
It's also not necessarily intuitive to other people which privilege is which. And so I just agree,
Yeah.
having it here would be helpful.
So let's see.
What would we add?
We can go back and
Well, go
come up
ahead.
with some language.
John feels confident we can add some language. So we'll,
We'll let John write the
yes, we will do that, and we will add that comment to, I guess, C.
John, would you be able to draft the language before the end of tomorrow so that when we have to present to the main committee, we'll have something ready?
Yeah, I can
We can talk
come
about
up with
that.
something, just,
Great.
yeah, probably, just this narrow section right here, it should be.
A
think,
completion of more
at
than one
least for me,
service
that-
obligation.
That'll be helpful when we try to write this, now that we know exactly how it's going to work.
Do you still want to write it in a proposal if we have the regulatory language included and it's?
No, the only reason that I needed to write was because what we had discussed was different than what was in here, which was
Yeah.
different than what was here, so that was the
Totally.
only reason.
Okay.
Yes, we're going to make that notation here. And we'll see what kind of language we can provide, clarifying language.
Actually, Aaron, I might add to the note that they have until year 5 to re-enroll. If they haven't completed no service.
Yes, I think we're good.
Thank you. If they have completed no service, and 8-year service clock will begin upon exiting. Oh, how do you even term that?
Ceases enrollment at the institution. Is that what you're
Ceases
trying to
enrollment
say?
at final institution, yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what they have in here already.
Yeah.
so.
Well, final institution still, yeah. At the final institution could still be a different
Yeah,
institution
I
from it was
think we
originally.
have that piece
Yeah.
kind of covered.
Okay.
Other comments? Or shall we move on to the next section, which we started talking about, the case of the teach grant recipient? The unless paragraph 3 applies, the paragraph 3. This is the case of the recipient who completed 1 or more academic years of credible teaching service during the period between the grant recipient's withdrawal and re-enrollment. In this case, the secretary does not adjust the starting date of the period for completing the service obligation. The completed service teaching counts toward satisfaction of the grant recipient's service obligation under C2 of this section, C2I of this section. And if the grant recipient continues to perform credible teaching service after re-enrolling in a teach grant eligible program, the grant recipient may receive credit toward satisfaction of the service obligation under paragraph C2 for any of the complete academic years of credible teaching performed while the recipient is concurrently enrolled in a Teach Grant eligible program, only if the recipient does not request and receive a temporary suspension of the period for completing the service obligation under one of the suspension options.
So I do want to reopen. I can understand why there couldn't be a delayed start in counting service years, but in this context, in the later regulation that we don't have printed out, it says that there is a clock suspension while they're re-enrolled in a subsequent Teach Grant eligible program. And I don't understand why they couldn't be accruing service years while they have that suspension for the earlier obligation.
Because you're doing a service obligation during an 8-year period, and if you're suspended, you're not in that service period.
So you wouldn't be, if I understand you correctly, then.
Maybe I.
Uh-oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, well, yeah, just to add to what Sophia said, the whole point of a suspension is that's to cover a time when you're not able to teach. And as Sophia said, you have to do the teaching can only apply if it's performed during the service obligation period. You have to do the 4 years, and when you're in a suspension status, the clock is stopped, so you're not teaching during the service. The whole point of a suspension is to cover times when you're not able to teach for some reason. So what we're saying here is that if you continue to teach once you enroll in school, you can receive credit for that teaching, assuming it's qualifying teaching, as long as you don't at the same time ask for a suspension of the 8-year period. Because otherwise you'd be doing teaching during a period when the 8-year service obligation clock is stopped. That's why. That's the and the reason that we aren't resetting the clock here if you taught during that interim period when you were out of school is because if we reset the clock, then all of that teaching would have been performed before your 8-year service obligation period even started.
And while I understand that, I still think the proposal
We're on, I think.
There we go. Okay, we're back. But it still puts someone in a position where if they were enrolled, this may be another diagram-friendly scenario. Okay, sorry, Linda. No worries. Okay, they enroll in a program. So Teach Grant program. And then they're out. They don't complete and they're out for 3 years. But they teach for 1. And then they re-enroll. I see how your proposal covers if they teach for the duration of the 3 years, that you'd want them to be covered for the 3 years. But if they only teach for 1, they're now in this position where they've already had 4 years elapse. They're going to be in for 2 more years. They either say, no, none of this counts, and then you're imposing an even higher service obligation on that student.
Could you request a suspension for a partial period? Meaning, if I requested a suspension because I was enrolled in a Teach Grant eligible program, would I have to request all of the years that I was enrolled, or could I request partial?
Well, they're granted in what do you, give me an example. But the bottom line is, it still goes back to the teaching service has to be performed while the clock is running. If the clock isn't running or we reset it, then it doesn't make sense really to say that you'd be able to count that teaching if it was performed either before your 8-year period started or while you had the clock suspended.
So I'm seeing this as being a graduate student because they're eligible to teach. And so they would essentially either have to weigh or would they have to have they would have to have their clock reset because it says the secretary will reset. So they're going to lose that year.
No, it says
So
that we
this-
don't reset it if you completed 1 or more years of teaching during that period that you were not in school. And the
It's live.
No. Okay, there it works again. Welcome back. Our live stream audio stopped for a little bit because one of the cables stopped working. So now we are reconnected and our audio should be working again. So where were we? Okay. We were talking about credible teaching service. And I can't actually even remember who was the last person to be speaking. Okay.
I was just out loud thinking about the concurrent completion of service and the service clock. And I see a benefit to allowing for concurrency, but at the same time, we'd have to draw some parameters around it so that I, as a graduate student, couldn't then take credit for something that happened very far in the path.
So I also want to reflect on the department's position, if I'm correct, is that they can't issue both. They can't do it concurrently as well, that would be a violation of the 8-year service period. However, the other alternative to preserve those teaching years could be that the department discharges the service obligation where they accept the service in between, which would practically create the same effect, that the service obligation could still restart, just they would have a reduced service obligation for the service years that they completed in between.
I think I see what you're saying. So if they were to complete 2 years, and then we wanted to reset, they would then have 6 after that,
So
rather than 8.
No. So what I'm saying is,
I
if they
think
taught
well.
for 2 in between, their clock could still restart at the conclusion of the program, and they would have 8 years to fulfill their obligation. But now, because they already taught for 2 qualifying service years, they would only have a service obligation of 2 years because the department would discharge 2 of the 4 years because they already taught for 2 in between.
I see.
So practically, it creates the same effect. The only difference is that they have a slightly longer time period. That's all.
That sounds a little bit like we're creating more stuff that doesn't need to be there. I mean, if they're getting the 2 years, they're halfway through already, and they still will have, and the clock the discharging of the obligation, I think it just pulls the department into one more piece of bureaucracy than is needed, because it sounds like this would function the way we all understand it to support them in finishing. So I guess I don't see why we would do that.
Well, just to add on to that, I think Deborah makes a good point. So to use kind of a simple example, you withdraw from a program for completing it, you then teach for 2 years, then you re-enroll in that same program, continue to teach during the year, say you're back in school for a year, you continue to teach, and you don't get a suspension. Well, at the end of that year, you've already satisfied 3 years of the service obligation. You've only got 1 more year to do, and you've got 5 years to do it. So I'm not sure that you're being disadvantaged in any way. And so I'm saying, you're not. How are you being harmed? You're keeping credit for the 3 years that you did, the 2 years you did while you were out of school, and the additional year you did while you were back in school, and your 8-year clock is running during that period. But at the end of that year, additional that final year in school, you've still got 5 more years of the 8-year period, and you've only got to teach for 1 more year. You've been teaching continuously for 3 years, so I'm not really sure that I think there seems to be impression that people are being disadvantaged in some way, but
I think her point was for people who maybe only taught for 1 year or something like that.
Right, where
And
it's not that that during the gap, they were teaching for the entirety of the gap. I agree with you. If it's 3 years, they only have 1 year left, the harm that's committed is significantly less. However, if they had a 4-year gap, they only taught for 1, they've already lost 4 years. They have 3 years remaining, and now they've had maybe a 2-year suspension for the completion of the program, but they still only have a limited amount of time to fulfill the remainder of the service obligation, even though they may not have been appropriately qualified for the high-need position during the initial break. And so that then becomes a question.
I just don't think we can, I think you can't write these regulations to cover every possible permutation of some withdrawal and re-enrollment in teaching, and some people teach. It's just not, as a practical matter, you simply can't do it. And what we're trying to do here is to ensure that these people who, it never really even occurred to us that this would happen, but we've heard that apparently it's not common, but it has happened, that the idea here is we want to let people retain credit for that teaching, and we're proposing some rules here that would do that. But you can't, you can't have it both ways. You can't restart the clock and allow periods of teaching you did before your 8-year period started to count towards the satisfying the service obligation. I'm not really seeing where people are being harmed by this.
So as a simple solution, instead of the secretary does not adjust the starting period, could there be something added in there unless the student requested it? Meaning the student would voluntarily be giving up that 1 or 2 years in order to have the clock reset if they fell into all of the other qualifying categories.
So they would be, so you did 2 years of teaching, and you might decide you wanted to just forfeit credit for that 2 years and then have to do another 4 years after you get out of school, that you might want to do that for some reason?
If you were up against the clock, you might.
Yeah.
But
If you were facing conversion and had the possibility, if the clock were reset, to not face conversion, then I think, yes, you would want to.
I don't understand, I think, the up against the clock. It's the same clock. So if you taught for 2 years and then you re-enroll, you could suspend and then while in program. So it's the same clock as if you had not suspended.
But like in her example, there was a 3-year stop out. So there's no suspension during that time, unless they had some other reason.
Right, but still then it's still the same clock. That's why I'm not quite getting what the harm is, because it's no different than, like, I feel like what's being suggested by some is giving, I think, a bit too much to the grant recipient that they aren't really deserving.
Any other grant recipient would have the clock reset. So this would just be allowing them to have that same option.
But the other grant recipients are not doing any teaching during that period when they're out of
But
school.
I think 1 year of teaching may not tip the scale in a beneficial way.
Yeah,
Well,
I
so
actually
that's
agree. If it was a voluntary, that they could voluntarily ask that the clock not be reset, I think that would address both concerns. I hear your concern that this may be a very narrow example, but at this point we don't really know, because these folks would have converted before they ever reached this point. So I do think that the option that a student can request that the clock not be reset and that those service years be counted would address both.
I have a question, because as we're talking about this is for master's degrees, right? We all know that, because you need to be able to be teaching, and for it to count, you have to be fully certified and et cetera. So, to hit that 5-year window there, I mean, could you imagine going back to a master's program after being out of it for 5 years? Okay, I'm just saying, because I understand, but it seems like those are more rare. I don't know.
So I have heard from a number of Teach grant recipients that are in that case where they begin a master's degree program, they're not doing it full time, something comes up, a life circumstance comes up, they can't actually fulfill their education requirements anymore, they'll leave and then will re-enter sometimes years later. And so it's not that unusual when you think about the burdens of the.
And I think in the education field especially, it's more prevalent.
So I think what we'll do is we'll take a shot at trying to draft something for this and see if it reflects what we've discussed at this table. So we want to make that note. Leave this out just in case we need. Oh. And then the only other thing we did here was we renumbered to 4, so 3 became 4. This language was there previously. Anything else before we move to teaching in a high-need field? Okay. So, for this, I guess we could go, no, I guess we can stay with the red line. It doesn't seem overly onerous, or do you want me to go to the clean copy? This is fine, okay. So, here we had teaching in a high-need field. Okay, listed in a nationwide list. In order for a grant recipient's teaching service in a high-need field listed in a nationwide list to count toward satisfying the recipient's service obligation, the high-need field in which he or she is prepared to teach must be listed in a nationwide list for the state in which the grant recipient teaches. And this language we kept from the last time and added just the repay like we talked about there. Were there any additional questions about this before we go to 3?
So I did, where the comment says Kira Stephen edit section for clarity.
Yes.
I did submit proposed
Okay.
language.
So let's pull that up then. This would be under, oops, let me find your language.
And actually, it should probably be A period and then B period, because that is the subsections underneath Romanettes, I believe, according to a quick Google.
Right here.
Mm-hmm.
Like this.
Because otherwise putting them together became, I struggled to make it less convoluted.
Okay, can you walk us through what you did?
Sure. So I took, when I was reading this initially, because there are so many premises that were boiled into this section, I tried to separate it out a little bit to make it more clear while still maintaining the formatting that was included within the other Romanette. And so if the grant recipient has one service obligation, at the time the grant recipient signed the agreement to serve, even if, and that it would still, because it's falling under D, teaching within a high need field. So basically, it would still count even if the field loses its high need designation in the state where the recipient teaches after the fact, before the recipient began teaching in that field. Ooh, that was not clear.
I think what you're trying to say is that it should count if it was when they signed the ATS.
Yes, exactly.
Now, how do we get it to
And
say
before, yes, exactly. And so my proposed language may not accomplish that. It did what I thought it did when I was drafting.
I thought we thought our language.
Yeah, no, totally.
Actually understand their language.
Okay.
Is there anything you would change to that language, or is it?
This one,
Oh, can you put it back? Yeah.
Let me just go. I was gonna pull that really quick. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Let me just clarify that we're looking at double I, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Hold on one second. I'm gonna.
Think through this.
I was fine with the first sentence and then got a little bit lost in the second sentence.
So
Yeah, so let me maybe talk through it and see if I understand the second part where it says, if you have more than one service obligation, so you have an undergraduate obligation and graduate obligation, and so you have those two, you can't satisfy both or all as they use here by teaching in the same high need field unless it's in the list for the state where you are, in which the grant recipient is teaching. I'm not sure I understand why
yeah,
that
so-
why that was
So
necessary.
the reason behind this is that you could teach, take coursework, be in a program of study at a time that you have initially started that subsequently becomes ineligible.
Right.
So that part of it is simple. The part that's less simple is that if you go back then and for, say, a graduate level degree in that same field, it's no longer eligible anymore because it's no longer eligible anymore. So,
But what about the revolving nature of this list? Because what if it loses, a state says it's not a high needs field, it's a high needs field, I get my undergraduate degree, I'm teaching and working off my service obligation, and I go and get a master's, and when I'm going back, so it's back to being a high needs field. Like, what if it fluctuates like that? To where it is.
Well, so then I think it would still be okay because you would, I think it's the question of, at the point when you sign the agreement to serve.
The second
and so
one.
here, right. And so here
So
the
the-
issue is if you have two concurrent agreements to serve, it could be included during your first agreement to serve, but not be included in your second agreement to serve. Or
Correct,
vice
but why does
versa.
that have to be specified?
Well,
I'm sorry, if
because-
it's already off the list by the time you're in that first program, why does it have to be specified that
Well,
it doesn't?
Because this assumes that it's a question of if it lost designation in the beginning, would you be able to have concurrent service for your second obligation under that in that first field, right?
But it also doesn't say concurrent, oh, am I on still? It doesn't say concurrent service in here. I mean, you're making that assumption. I'm not reading this as concurrent.
But there would be an aspect of it that would be concurrent because the service clock would be suspended while in the second program. But my understanding of our conversation of this the last time was that we wanted service that was reflected in the most recent agreement to serve to count for both, to count for concurrent service. I think was where we were going. To make it easier administratively for the recipient to comply with the service requirement. And so that
I don't
was what
think that would
tried.
ever happen because if they weren't fulfilling the first agreement to serve, it would be because it was on the list, because their second one was on the list. Does that make sense? So it would have been on the list at the time they signed. So it's no matter what, they would be fulfilling it. Because you can either fulfill it by having it be on the list when you sign the ATS or while you are practicing, if that's what they call it, teaching.
Teaching, yeah.
We call it teaching.
So, either way, you would be able to fulfill it.
Yes. I think. We may be talking about different circumstances here. So my example is that you go and get your undergraduate degree in high school science, okay? That teaching position subsequently falls off of the high need list, but you're still okay because it was on the list initially. You go back and get your master's degree, and now you're doing it in high school computer coding, okay? Some really esoteric thing. Or not, I don't know. And it's on, now that is on the list. You would only, as long as you're teaching in a computer coding program and it's on the list for the last agreement to serve, you would receive concurrent service, even for that first program, if you're teaching in a computer coding program. Computer coding position, after the second program.
You would be, because in order to get the Teach grant for that computer coding, or are you saying that one fell off the list
Then that one
also?
subsequently falls off the list.
I
also.
see.
Could I-
Can-
Okay.
can
so
I-
that-
We're gonna-
I think
when
this
it-
was what it was intended.
Can the
this was what it was
department
intended to
clarify?
Can I give, I think it's really helpful sometimes to give an example
Yeah.
of what we're trying to do here. And this really only applies if you're teaching in something other than one of the core high need fields. So science wouldn't be a good example because that's always a high need field. So let's say, for example, you got an undergraduate degree in music education. And in your state, there was, at the time you got one of these Teach grants, there was a shortage of high school music teachers. So when you get out, you could satisfy the service obligation for your undergraduate service obligation by teaching high school music, even if music was no longer listed at the time you started teaching. If you then go back to graduate school and you get a master's degree in music education, but music has never returned to the high need list, you cannot satisfy that graduate service obligation by teaching music. You can only teach, that's what this is saying.
Which is different than the problem she brought up.
Well, so then I guess we would be saying it would qualify for but then would we want either list compiled at either point in time for either ATS to count for concurrent service going forward?
I
mean,
don't think so. I think that would go against the intent of the statute, because then that same student that he described could go back to graduate school for the music when it's no longer on any list and hasn't been for a while.
Well, but he wouldn't. That would no longer be a Teach grant eligible program to go back and get your master's degree at all. So that example isn't quite on point.
Well, that's actually kind of the rationale behind this, that if music is no longer listed as high need when you go back to graduate school, then you shouldn't be getting a Teach grant to teach in a
you
subject
know in
area that's not
advance
a high
that
need
it's
field
not.
anymore.
But you wouldn't be able to get a Teach grant for that anymore.
Well,
Your school, yeah,
that's true,
exactly.
but all right, and just as an aside here, for what it's worth, this was a question that was raised by our servicer, but when we asked if this had ever actually come up, it was no. It was just, what should we do if this came up? So we're trying to say how we think it should be handled.
So the
So
servicer.
you still have a valid issue, though, because your student would have no way of fulfilling either
Yeah.
obligation at that point.
Or they'd be in one position.
No, they would not be able to fulfill both, I guess is what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
exactly. And so my sort of workaround was that as long as they fulfill the obligation under the second ATS, because that's the most recent point in time, and you assume if they're going back to get their master's degree, they want to teach in that area, that would count, even if the second ATS dropped off the list. Or the ATS field, right? Because it's most recent. And it would still count for the backwards looking service. So we start with, we'll stick with music.
Do you want to use the board so our people
Yeah.
watching can see?
You guys got me moving today. Okay. Okay. So you start with a master's program. Undergrad. Yeah. Okay. So undergrad. In high school music. We'll stick with this example. Okay.
And
Then-
it's on the list.
And it's on list. Okay. But, oh no. We're going forward.
Now, they're not in trouble yet.
No, because they're still okay from this ATS, okay? But now, they've got higher ambitions. And they want a master's degree. in visual arts, in visual elementary instruction.
And it's on the list.
Right. Right. On list. But oh no.
We have no Wi-Fi access now.
Okay. Here we get to like 6 months, and now this is off list.
Or even 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years, it could be ending up problematic.
Right. Totally. And so now they're kind of stuck, right? Like, which ATS is the ATS that you follow? Do you require them to go back and become a music teacher again? Because that's when they initially sign their ATS. Or do you allow them to continue teaching as like a art teacher?
Well, you couldn't satisfy both. The second service obligation you could satisfy by teaching visual elementary instruction, but you couldn't satisfy whatever remains of the first service obligation by teaching in that subject unless visual elementary instruction happened to have also been listed, I think, at a time you got one of your undergraduate teachers.
Well, but then you have people in an untenable position because they can fulfill this, but all of this still.
Well, you'd have to
So
teach.
converts.
I mean, well, it wouldn't convert necessarily. Depends on whether you might have to do some. It might not be. You'd have to do a total of 8 years of teaching, 4 years of teaching music, and 4 years of teaching visual elementary instruction.
What I would do is double check the list for overlapping. I would see what was on the ATS, and just thinking practically.
I mean, some of that is, I mean, part of this is we're hoping that these students are thinking about and being aware enough to, and they've got to have some ownership. I mean, this person in particular might really have problems, yes, but that's also their choice.
Sure, you go back
I
to
don't
school
know.
before you've fully satisfied the undergraduate service obligation and get a degree in some completely different field that at the time you get it is to prepare you to teach in a subject area that is listed as high need, and you've still got a couple of years. You need to think about that. How are you going to do it?
But how would you counsel a student to expect, like, there are states where, you know, maybe every year they've had art teacher listed on their high need list, and then they're just unlucky. Like, how would you, like, I don't see this being a problem with the student. I see this a
But
problem
if it was
with the
listed
system.
at the time you got your teach grant, you're okay. It doesn't matter. This only comes into play if you then go back to graduate school, and you have some responsibility to consider what your obligation is and whether you still have. If you, as Deborah said, you have to have some ownership here and think about it. And
Well, so then should that be in the initial counseling to the effect of do not
Or at least for
enroll?
graduate.
So
Yeah.
here's my thinking. I mean, in this example, undergraduate high school music, your obligation is to that field. And so I don't think there can be a situation where any potential future field you might, I just feel like your obligation is to music. If you choose to go into something else and you hadn't checked to see that it was also on the list at the same time, that's your choice. And no one's saying you can't do that, but that has implications for your obligation under what you initially signed for music. And so I actually don't see a problem in this at all.
But David, are we then saying that once you enter into agreement for a teach grant, you have to finish that obligation before entering to another obligation?
No, I think then, but you make those choices based on the information. So this person going into visual elementary, if they're not intending to continue on with music education to complete that obligation, they do that with knowledge of the visual. It might not necessarily count.
And I'm fine with that as long as we make that very clear
Sure.
in the disclosures.
That's going to be really hard to make clear. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there.
I mean, the way to make it really clear is to say only music can count for music. And that we would, there'd be no counting of any other field. I mean, that's the most clear thing to say. I don't think that's what's
I have to
being-
strongly object to that. I mean, the intent is just
no.
to get them in a high need field. I don't want to restrict them to one field.
No, I'm not. I'm not suggesting.
He was trying to make an example.
Exactly.
He's not saying only music
Right.
is a high need field.
Right,
He's
right.
just saying, well, go ahead.
No, I mean exactly. I'm just trying to say like that would be the most clear thing to say. Only music can count for music. That's not what it is. It's not what I'm suggesting. So even by allowing that some other high needs can count, it muddies it a little bit. I think it's a good muddying. But if we're talking about ultimate clarity, music for music, there you go. That's the ultimate. That's not so.
Actually, yeah, maybe administratively it's not that bad, because the other piece is you could have this teacher and then they become a sped teacher and they'd still be fine. That would still be qualifying service. So I think as long as we make it clear that if their obligation has fallen off the list, they should not re-enroll, I think that would make it way better.
Can I ask a question? And it comes from your example of computer science. Because now there are computer science teacher certificates, and I'm sorry for bringing this up now, but now there are computer science teacher certificates, is that considered science in this realm?
We have said that it would be counted as science. There is no definition
Okay,
of science, but we've been asked specifically as computer science is science, and we've said yes.
Thank you.
Where can teachers figure out those kinds of distinctions?
I just have to say, if you, okay, well, I won't.
Well, there
As a
isn't any
physicist,
place
I'm gonna
where
shut up.
we are not going to, if we wanted to define science, I think we'd have to do it through regulations.
No, okay, I'm not
And the
asking
National
for you
Science
to define
Foundation would get
science.
involved.
I am asking a broader question. So I've heard from teach grant recipients who were told by FedLoan that if they taught as a general elementary education teacher, but they had more than 30% special education students, they could count as a special education teacher. There's a question of whether or not a behavioral specialist in a school who deals with discipline issues counts as a special education teacher. There are new positions within schools that arguably could fall within some of these categories, but there's no way for the teacher to know for sure, to know whether or not they're in or out, or what criteria would enable them to figure it out. And so that is, it is a legitimate question, believe it or not.
I think what our thinking right now is that there really isn't any criteria by which that's done. It's more likely something that would occur on a case-by-case basis with new fields that may be coming in that didn't exist. We would probably look at that not through a regulatory, but more on a case-by-case basis with the guidance or something like that as those things are brought to our attention, because we just don't have any way of really doing that.
And so I assume that would also be included within the dispute resolution process, that if a teacher disagreed about how their teaching position was categorized and they had a legitimate reason to believe that it did qualify, then they would be able to raise their case with the department.
Yeah, although I think in some cases the dispute, it conceivably could never even get to us if you had a school official who was refusing to sign it because they didn't, so the dispute might have to be with, before we even saw it, you see what I'm saying? We wouldn't even know about it.
That's raising a different issue. I'm talking about folks that write in, this is my high need position, it gets rejected, and then even though that high need position may actually fall within some of the high need positions, either in the state or as they've been articulated under statute.
But wouldn't that actually fall to the administrator? Because if you're at a school where you're teaching in a high need, they consider it high needs, and they sign your form, the department, or both the department and the servicer, don't dispute that signature and say, we don't trust that that is a high needs field.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, they
Do
do.
they?
Uh-huh.
This doesn't fall to the principal
Yeah,
of
to
the
be
school.
clear, if they list one of the other high-need fields from the nationwide list, we do verify, just like we verify that the school is in the low-income school directory. So are you saying there could be, I think where the problems can come up is that sometimes the name of that high-need field it's not listed the same in the nationwide list as it was listed on the form, and there's been some confusion about that. But they just need to be worked out on a case-by-case basis, so.
Okay.
So returning all the way back to the language under 2I, where you had said that the servicer was asking for some sort of guidance, however, a grant recipient who's blah, 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 blah. Is that something that instead could be approached through guidance and we could just strike all of that, since it seems to be, perhaps I'm incorrect, so committee, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to just add more confusion? Is that something where
We're okay with that.
striking however on, you're like, get rid of it?
We could
2,
just
Roman numeral 2, so
Right.
under 2, double I, Roman
Strike
double
everything
I.
beginning with however.
Yes, I'm looking at the clean language. 13, at the
Two.
top of the page. So striking from however further on.
So, Aaron,
'Cause-
it would be from however, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to strike that. Yeah, and then make a note that be addressed in guidance.
In guidance to the servicer. Since you said this probably hasn't happened before or
Well,
something.
no, we got the question a while back, and I thought, well, seems like this would be a really unlikely scenario, so I asked, have you ever actually encountered this, or are you just asking, you were thinking that this might happen, and if it does, how do we handle it? And I was told they were just wondering if it were to come up, how would we handle it? So as far as we know, this has never happened. So
Thank you.
one thing our servicers they're very good at thinking of all possible scenarios that could come up, and they understandably like to have rules in place to cover everything, and this was one of those situations. But
Okay, so I think that would cover 686.12 for you, correct? Given the language that you've provided. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Anything else on double I, or should we move to 3?
Question. I do just want to put a plug in to continue our conversation about the nationwide list itself. I know that was a conversation we started as we were talking about definitions, but we're asked to hold that for later on.
Yes.
And I think
This is where?
somewhere in here. It doesn't
Yes.
have to be at this exact moment, but before we completely move on.
Yes.
Seems to be a good opportunity to do that.
Okay. How would you like to, what would you like to say about it?
I guess there was just a question of, as we're thinking about specifically the department's interpretation of what's in statute, which I read earlier, which dealt with the provision that says we're in section 420N of the statute, number 2, demonstration of teach grant eligibility. Under B, agreements, or maybe I'm going the wrong direction, but under, 420N, under B, agreements to serve, and then it provides, under B1C, teach in any of the following fields: math, science, foreign language, bilingual education, special ed, reading specialist, or another field documented as high need by the federal government, state government, or local educational agency and approved by the secretary. So it seemed like, to refresh our conversation from earlier, that the department was not using a fully inclusive nationwide list, and was, in their own way, perhaps based on their interpretation, narrowing down who and what fields under the nationwide list would be eligible under this section.
So if you're asking whether we're tying the high need field to be a teacher grant eligible field to that extent, yes. Is that what you mean? No, that's not what you mean.
So let me clarify. So we're all looking, first of all, we're all looking at 3, right? Just to be clear. As I read this, it seems very muddy, that you can't, so as I read this, and maybe I just need more coffee, it's basically saying you can't, if you're an element, you can't declare elementary teachers as a shortage field, a high needs field, and it says or secondary school teachers. So I would just like some clarification on what the intent is here, and then we can go from there. So if you could explain, to me it reads awkwardly. I don't know if to anybody else it reads awkwardly.
Yeah, I think we were
So,
before with it reading
yeah.
more than once.
What's the intention here, or the?
So here we're tying. So once again, here we're tying, and if we're looking at 3, we're looking at 2 things here. A grant recipient cannot satisfy the requirements of the agreement to serve or repay if the teaching service is in a geographic region of a state or a specific grade level not associated with the high need field of the state. And again, the critical language is not associated with a high need field of a state designated in a nationwide list as having a shortage of elementary or secondary school. So what we're trying to say here is that if you're, I don't know, second graders, short of second grade teachers in elementary that are not teaching in a high need field, those would not be qualifying.
Why?
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 Because the statute is trying to put teachers in high need.
Right, but
I
if
don't.
but if,
Go, you go.
if a state or a region like rural schools are desperate for teachers, period, and that's an incredibly high need, and so it almost at one point when it was saying a geographic region, I kind of got hopeful because I think there has to be some flexibility. The statute says the federal list, a state list, or even an LEA. So an LEA could declare that they're in a state of crisis and that really it's a high need field, and it may not stay high need. Like, we're not expecting it necessarily. If they got high need, if they got teachers in, maybe it would fall off that list. But you're tying the hands of rural America for getting high need teachers by doing this, because they may have, there's portions of states where, rural Illinois, you got Chicago, that's super urban. You have pockets of Illinois, and I'm just using it as an example, where they're desperate for teachers of all kinds. And it's a high need.
And I don't think the statute prevents inclusion.
So this might be one of those situations where if you can develop, if you want to develop some alternative language for that.
I agree.
Well, that would be an alternative, right?
It would be.
Right. I'm just saying. Because we can't. Well, there are. We talked about this last time, which is there's the costing, the issue of the cost of doing this.
It's mandatory money. And really, if you want to say to the nation that you want to support education and have educated citizenry, then yeah, it costs money. But this is a mandatory program. The money will just go out the door. And it's not necessarily that it's going to stay and it's going to shift, and it will make things complicated. That list becomes more and more important. But I hear that there's a cost concern, but I also push back and say, it was made mandatory money for a reason, because the Congress recognized that this was important and that you didn't want to tie the hands to discretionary funding. So
it also makes it a lot easier for students to navigate and understand.
And again, there's nothing in the statute, the way that the statute is written, that would prohibit the department from allowing any of these teachers from qualifying, as long as they are high need in either by the state or the LEA.
And
really-
actually, just the contrary, it confuses the rest of counseling. And what we're really trying to establish here is the opportunity for others to teach in those high needs situations.
I do think, though, on the flip side, it does make us have to be clear and be focused on this when we're counseling, because the fact, I mean, and I don't know how we solve this, because if we are going to get down to the LEA type level, and also we need to make sure that the LEAs are working with the states so that the states will say that this is a real issue. I mean, there's other things along the path that still will not make this easy or happen even necessarily.
But I caution that, again, the language of the statute refers to a high-need field, not a geographic area.
Right, but the statute also says that, let me find it. Another field documented as high need by the federal government, the state government, or local education agency and approved by the secretary. So while, yes, I hear that Congress has laid out the high needs fields, in fact, we don't even necessarily always bring up that even a foreign language is considered a high need field right now. And we talk a lot about STEM, but the secretary can say no, but the regions, the LEAs, the state should have the right to say, we are in crisis and this is a high need for us. Because you know what, it doesn't matter if you have a physics teacher if the kids don't have elementary teachers in the classroom who know how to teach and know pedagogy and teach them how to read.
All right. Okay. So let's hold that question for a moment. But I just do want to point again, it talks about fields and not geographic areas. And I think it's 2:30, so past 2:30, so we probably should take a quick break. And then, that is the correct time, right? Okay. So that's our 2:30 break is a little bit late. And then we'll come back to this after the break. Okay. Oh, 10 of 20. That's all. I guess we'd have to say 55 at this point, 2:55, because it's not enough time otherwise. Okay. Thank you. Welcome back from our break, everybody. So we were talking about number 3 under the nationwide list, and so was there an alternative proposal then to strike that? Is that what's finally?
Yes.
Are we good?
Yes.
Okay.
So
Sorry
I
about
would suggest to strike that. As we had already discussed, I don't believe it goes against anything in the statute, even though it may have achieved listing status based on region. They're still teaching in a field, so you can't be a teacher without having a field. So I think it still complies with the statute and would make it a lot easier for students to understand.
All right. So with that, I think we can move on to the next section. I think that the red lines that follow that are just no change from the last time initially. And I'm looking for the first time where we have some changes. Would probably be in section .32. And oh, did you add that we're going to have an alternative proposal for that? C. For number 3, 3D, D3.
This, the grant receiving cannot satisfy this?
Yes, yeah, we're not striking it, but there's gonna be a strikeout and a not strikeout.
Okay.
So,
Sort of to that
But
point, though,
why?
before you do that, the secretary has discretion in the statute, and so there's no need to reiterate it in regulation, is part of our thinking, to clarify things. I mean, the statute clearly says that you have all these other alternatives, but it's at the approval of the secretary, I believe. I'll have to, sorry, I flipped to the wrong page. But approved by the secretary. So again, if the secretary chooses not to approve these, you don't need to have this in regulation because the secretary, in many cases, although admittedly I've not looked at said list, it's probably not listed. So I don't think you need to carry this any further than where it is in the statute.
I agree.
so that's back to striking it then.
Yes, but you said you were having an alternative.
No, the
you were-
alternative is the strikeout. We are not striking out this language yet.
Right. So I was trying to engage you in a conversation about why the strikeout really does serve the purpose and leaves a tremendous amount of discretion in the hands of the secretary, without needing to actually. You could tie the hands of the secretary later if you leave this in regulation as it is, and the flexibility resides in the statute. I think that's something for the department to consider, that there's real flexibility there.
So, I mean, we're obviously going to be reviewing all of these things as we're going along, but I think in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to leave the one section with it not struck out, and then another one with the strikeout being the alternative proposal to this.
Could you clarify why you want to keep that there?
Yeah.
Once again, we are tying the field of study or the subject as to being high need to the high need.
Which
But
you're already
if you're
doing
an
without it.
elementary teacher, that's a field, and if a place really needs it as high need and submits it, like the LEA submits it to the state, and the state agrees to put it on their list to submit to the secretary, the department, aka the secretary, still has, through the statute, the ability to not list it instead.
So this
in-
language existed in
and-
the original regulations and I think they were tying it at that point to the subject areas.
But it
So
was,
unless we,
But if you say secondary school teacher, I mean, we're talking about teachers here overall. I guess, sorry, I probably cut you off.
no,
Please
no,
say
no, it's
more.
okay. No.
Please say
It's,
more.
I mean, it's basically, we are for this purpose of this discussion, going to retain this language as it is, but we are also going to add the proposal of striking it as an alternative.
So
And
then
then
what
have
does that
it
mean functionally? Like for our,
functionally,
like-
you would talk about both.
okay, and so I think the room understands the rationale in terms of why the department may not want to, for whatever reason, expand the nationwide list. But the question is just whether the department needs to restrict themselves in regulation to never considering the full nationwide list. Does that make sense?
So,
So right now,
That-
basically, you could, in function, not include what I think the full table, I don't want to speak for everyone, but may think should be included here, or you may not. But if you write it in regulation, you may not, and any future administration may not. And what's challenging about that, obviously, with higher education rulemaking, you have to, it's not as simple as, proposing a change with a notice and comment period in most cases. So.
And
So
also,
just the
and
question.
so,
Yeah.
and so, but that's why we're saying, we, as far as we're concerned, we are happy to have both points, both struck out and not struck out language presented as part of what we present next week.
so I'm actually a little bit to your comment about field.
Oh, I should have
versus-
said subject, but whatever.
This language as it reads, outside of the strike, not strike, is confusing. So if you're
Right.
going to keep it, I think this conversation would be more helpful to understand, like, this language as it is doesn't necessarily clearly, it doesn't strike me, I'm not sure what's really going on with it, because you're talking about geographic regions of a state or specific grade level not associated with a high need field, blah, 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 as having a shortage of elementary or secondary teachers. It's kind of like two different ideas kind of thrown together. So I think it would also be helpful if you even clarified language for us, offered some other language, so
could
maybe
try
we could
doing that again.
understand it.
This is the original language. We had offered language last time, which people found confusing and wanted to go back to the original language.
I
So.
don't remember that language, sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I remember, because
Yeah.
I was one of the people that brought up the concern about the proposed language. I still think that.
Sorry, I forgot.
This, I still go back to, which is why I support striking it. I'm not sure why this would be in here. It doesn't help, and I think it confuses. And so, whether expansion of list or not expansion of list, the language as proposed that you want to keep up as one of the options, it just is still confusing to me.
Yeah, this is, sorry.
So no, I was going to say, we can look at it again and see if there's any other way that we could maybe clarify this, but if,
Could we talk about, like, what's the department trying to achieve in this language?
well, this is the original language, as I mentioned prior.
Correct.
And so
Since we
our
weren't at the
belie-
original
Our belief
rulemaking.
is that this was intended to tie the subject areas, not a geographic level or not a specific grade level, and it's kind of negative language, not associated with a high
really-
need field.
So,
So the idea would be that you would want an association only if there's a high need field association to flip it.
I mean, I
But
think
it's
even,
still,
sorry.
no, it's still I clunky, but that's how they wrote it initially.
My initial recollection of our conversation last time, and someone may have a better recollection than I, was that Brian explained that the purpose behind the language was to say explicitly that Teach Grant recipients could not use any general education position to count. Is that correct?
that was, I don't think that was the entire thing, but I think that was part of it.
And that was the crux of the explanation. And on one hand, I hear what you're saying, that you're trying to tie it to a subject, but the requirement under the statute, and as we explained it earlier in the regulations, is that it is a teaching field. And I still am unclear as to why the department's position originally was to exclude the general education.
Yeah, and the best I can tell you is exactly this, that there was an attempt to tie these things together, but there isn't, we'd looked, and there wasn't anything in the notice of proposed rulemaking, there wasn't anything in the final regulations specifically addressing this. That means that language was agreed to at the table, and at that time, for whatever reason, nobody found it to be confusing or otherwise felt a need to question it. So there's a lot of things like that in particularly how we did your regulations back further in time you go, where if people just agreed to things, they didn't necessarily have a great need to go into huge explanations. And since there were clearly no comments about it, which would be the other place that you'd get them, it just went forward this way. So I think that there's, I mean, that doesn't explain why they did what they did, but is our belief that that's how it was.
Okay. But Sophia, so you're saying that, because we spend a lot of time talking about the nationwide list.
Yes.
And its relevance to this, but.
And again, the nationwide list is not intended to be a strictly teach thing. It does cover other.
Correct.
Other functions.
However, the way that we are using the list, as well as how we have referred back to the list, seems to be contrary to where we're going with this particular
in what way do
section,
you mean that?
in which we are narrowing it in even more, because we've already said that the Secretary of Education already has the ability to narrow the listing. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Education also has the ability to modify the list of fields, and so there seems to be some other reason why we are looking at this as keeping it than to delete it altogether. If I'm
So sort of considering this, granted none of us were in the room, and we are talking about moving forward. The teaching field and the needs of the nation are vastly different than they were 10 years ago. And when the last regs were written. And I can understand, the concern of wanting to be specific that it's high needs fields, that's the purpose, is to get teachers in high needs fields in those high needs schools. I think, though, looking forward, and I'm willing to try and draft something that even carves out an opportunity for the Secretary to consider where the case is made by either the LEA or the region or the state to allow teach grants to be utilized for things like an elementary education degree, or, secondary school teachers is a very, you don't teach in high school with a broad stroke unless they're desperate for you. So if there's ways where, I would be interested in working out some language that is creating the allowable condition, but not a requirement necessarily, to hit so that regions, rural areas really could use these as a recruitment tool. Actually there are institutions that serve rural districts in the state of Iowa that use teach grants to recruit in and help, and because they want to stay in the rural community. So that we are continuing with this vision of actually looking forward and in the perspective of this.
I think the problem then would become, as a student, how do you know? If it's discretionary and written in such where the secretary may approve it, how do I know then as a student, either at the time of signing or when I go into teaching?
It would have to go into, sorry.
But, so you would know because this list would reflect what the department had already approved.
Yeah.
So whatever this list is at the time you sign the agreement to serve is good for the duration of your service.
So
period.
not only are you suggesting the discretion, but you're suggesting an actual list that they would create.
Yeah, this would not be, I mean, I imagine that there could be the potential already for states to send forward high needs requests, and that the secretary has the discretion to not put that into the list or to approve it. But I'm just trying to think of a way forward, and of course it would have to be published. And so, you know, again, we face the same things that we face across the board I don't know if it's making, you know, I'm also want to think through it a little bit to see if this isn't, it is adding a little wrinkle of complication, but might be able to address some real emerging needs that didn't necessarily exist, at least not as bad. It might have existed in areas 10 years ago, but it seems to be real cries. We actually know of regions that are desperate for elementary school teachers. And there are also some elementary programs where you're getting an emphasis in chemistry or an emphasis in in even a particular science field. And would they be kicked out? I don't know. Are they in the list? I don't know. You know, so this evolutionary concept is something I would like to explore a little bit. I don't know what anybody else thinks.
Well, and I would agree. I think we got to think innovation when you talk about this, because schools are being encouraged to be more innovative. Higher education is encouraged to be more innovative, and I see this clashing with that, especially as we try to prepare or better prepare educators for some of our rural communities and making sure that they're served at an equal rate.
And to be clear, I may not come up with good language. Or, you know, we may just want to go.
So you're suggesting this to be something you'd have for tomorrow, or what are we saying?
Turning away from the camera. I will try, yes, to have something for us for tomorrow. And if anybody has things that they would, you know, want to give a little input.
And you're talking about drafting language for a new list, so that a new list would exist separately from this list?
No. This is where I need some time to really think about how to operationalize this. If it's even, like I said, I may be making it.
I think without a new list, it's going to be very problematic to navigate.
Well, I mean, if the teacher shortage area list is an accurate listing of all the positions that someone could receive a teach grant for.
If we're going to include all of them, I thought what you were describing was where the secretary just had ultimate discretion and could approve these areas or not approve them. But if we are going to just allow them, that's different in my brain.
Well, because right now that is the way the list exists. That all of the positions that are listed, except for general education positions,
and
count.
that's a known. That's easy for me to,
Yeah.
and for students to understand
Sure.
if they read it. But if you're saying some maybe and some wouldn't be, that
I think
becomes cloudy.
Yeah, I hear you. I
So-
don't know if I can come up with that. Go
So are you
ahead.
suggesting not to do anything then, just to go with the other, in other words, don't draft any additional language, just go with the strikeout?
Right.
Okay.
Or I also like the idea of a federal list that alleviates all potential confusion.
I mean, it sounds as though the federal list could also include LEA distinctions, which are not currently present in the list as it currently operates, that there would be more flexibility, and then it would be existing as a separate subset so that the other policy considerations, I am not sure how the teacher shortage area list implicates other policy initiatives that the department is engaged in. So I think that
We
that
did
is...
not get rid of the shortage list. It does have other implications, but we also are not inclined to create a separate new list just for this purpose either.
So what other laws rely on this list, or what other funding determinations rely on this list?
No, teacher loan forgiveness doesn't impact now. There may be a Perkins cancel, I'm not positive about that.
There's at least a couple
There
of
is
things
an
I know.
old FEL program
It says right in
deferment.
your little
Not many
document
borrowers
in the front.
qualify for any anymore. You can get
There's a
a,
big document.
certain borrowers with older FEL loans can get a deferment by teaching in one of these shortage areas, but I don't know. It probably has implications for some other programs, maybe not maybe not Title IV programs that I'm not familiar with.
But in theory,
Tell
it
you.
sounds like those are all additional obligations that are put on teachers. Is that correct?
So according to the teacher shortage area nationwide list, the federal designation of teacher shortage areas in a state is relevant to the following provisions relating to federal student financial aid programs. Under 34 CFR 682.210Q, that's kind of long, a borrower who teaches in one of these areas and who is a new borrower in a federal Stafford loan program or the federal supplemental loans for students program on or after July 1, 1987, but before July 1, 1993, qualifies for a deferment of loan repayment for up to 3 years while the borrower is in repayment. A new borrower is a borrower who did not have an outstanding balance, so on and so forth. Federal direct loan borrowers owe an outstanding balance on a federal Stafford loan or in a federal SLS loan before July 1, 1993 may also qualify. Then there's federal Perkins loan borrowers who are full-time teachers of math, science, foreign languages, bilingual education, or any other field of expertise where the state education agency determined there is a shortage of qualified teachers to qualify for cancellation of up to 100% of the Perkins loan. And then they talk about teach. So those are, in general, what we would be talking about.
Then there is a policy rationale to make teach consistent with the other other benefits that teachers would otherwise receive. Like, we would want this to be consistent with teacher loan forgiveness, the Perkins forgiveness schemes. I mean, my question was more, if you switch that list, does it change schools' eligibility for any funding? Like, are there secondary implications? But what you've just read is that it's only how benefits are awarded to teachers, and that all of those other programs would have more ways to fulfill their obligation than teach grant recipients.
Well, they're different programs.
Right, but if there's no statutory obligation for the department, I mean, this is where I think either the department standardizes teach along with those other programs, or creates a separate list.
As well as if the need still arises, then this also helps alleviate that problem.
Well, and as I just opened up to a random page in said list. I'm not sure which state I'm in because it's going back in time, but potentially I'm looking at Missouri. And they do actually get down to naming what looks to be, and again, my cursory look, counties, and looking at different issues and different things there. So this may be more, they list off all the counties and then list some subjects with counties later. So it looks like it does kind of dig into some regions as well. Do we know, or is there a way for the department to find out, search this list, whichever one is the most up to date, and see if any elementary, I mean, I think elementary is the biggest one in terms of not being listed off as high needs. If anybody has declared that in said list.
So I can tell you, after looking through the list, there are elementary.
Yeah. So maybe it's actually getting captured in there, in which case just striking this is sufficient.
But the department is still denying those because they're general education.
But if we strike it, so right now this language is in regulation, so they have to deny it. If we strike it,
They don't
then
have to. They
don't-
could, but they don't have to.
But they don't have to, and so for those regions that are declaring elementary, so I'll back off from my recommendation of other language and just say, return to my initial, which is strike, which.
Yeah, and I
others
would
are in
say
the room.
either strike or leave and have a secondary list, because it becomes hard, that's all.
I agree. Listen, I think that's the easiest way. If we're going to keep the language, you have to have a secondary list, right? Because right now it's confusing and it's contradictory to all the rest of the work that we've done.
So,
I think
ahead.
most folks have weighed in. David, do you have thoughts on this? Just so we can get, as we're getting a sense of the room on this issue.
Mike.
No, I mean, I think I voiced earlier that my preference would be to strike this portion. I think that clarifies it completely.
anyone else on this issue?
So just to summarize, so we have it correct when we report back. The department's position is that the language should stay, and that the extension, and that the whereas the rest of the committee has come to consensus that it should be struck. Okay.
And also that if the department's language stay, I think we kind of all agree there really should be a secondary list that doesn't exist yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Or actually, on that thought, this is a federally compiled list. As the list is being compiled, it may be easier to indicate an ineligible field, region, however you wanted to do that. But so that as a student was looking it up when they arrived at, oh, there I am, it would say right there, ineligible for teach. Just a thought. Rather than doing a second list, just modify the current list. I mean, since teach is the only outlier within the programs that the list is directed to, that's where the inherent confusion is coming from anyway.
That's technically still providing another list, though.
So like an asterisk or something?
Yes, maybe not even an asterisk, because as you're looking, let's say you had that, you would be like, oh, I get an asterisk. Yay. You wouldn't know what it would mean, really. So I do think expressly saying ineligible for teach would be important.
To the next section then. I think we didn't change any other or work on any other language until we get to counseling requirements under point 32. The language that was the red line language there before, where we changed aggregate to total and master's to graduate study. So that was from before, and we didn't have nobody had anything to say about that. So counseling requirements on point 32. So starting with initial counseling, this is the language that we had there before. Just I've added repay everywhere, or repay. Until we get down to Romanet 7. There. So I don't know if it's easier to look at this in the clean version or the this version. I don't know if anybody has a. We can look at it in the clean version if you want, but that might be easier. You want to pull up the clean version for that. Go back up. Yeah, I think I know I saw subsequent counseling go by, so I know we've gone too far. And back down to 7. Roman, there it is.
But we do need to.
Yeah.
Sorry, there was language in 2 that we previously struck in another section.
Oh, where are
so
you
we
looking?
I'm looking at under B2.
Page 17.
Yeah, page 17 on the redlined copy.
Oh, this was from the previous conversation.
Right,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to take that out as well.
Okay.
So Erin, it's
However, yeah, go back to 2. 2. No, you're right.
Yeah. I was going to drag us back there.
So 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you
The
go, right
however.
there.
Okay.
For teaching service performed, so number 2. And then however a grant recipient to the end, that
Just like
language
we
is all
did the
going to
other
get struck.
one.
Just like we did before.
Yeah. That's a good catch. Okay. Yep. Yes. So this is the clean version under 7. So these are things that were either, we worked on the language for clarity. So let's start with 7. So here we said that we will explain the circumstances that we describe in point 4.3 under which a teach grant will be converted to a direct unsubsidized loan, including an explanation that if the grant recipient requests that a teach grant be converted, the conversion of the teach grant to a loan cannot be reversed. Oh, wait a minute, why is it 8 right there? See how it goes 8? That should be 1 down. See, there's Roman at 8 right there after reverse. That should come after 7. So for some reason that did not.
This here?
Yeah, that should be down. Yep, now we need a 9.
I'll fix it in that.
Okay. So let's just start with that. So essentially what we did was we moved the language, or I should say the concept of converting early to the next piece, as opposed to rolling it all into one sentence or one part. So that so 7 and 8 go together, so then we would explain that to further avoid further accrual of interest, a grant recipient who decides not to teach in a qualified school or field or for any other reason no longer intends to satisfy the obligation may request the secretary convert his or her teach grant to a direct unsubsidized loan. The grant recipient may begin repaying immediately instead of waiting for the teach grant to be converted to a loan under the conditions under point 43. So we took that idea that we had previously had in the original red line and broke it into these two things.
And actually, the original red line needs fixed. There's 2 8s in it as well.
Yeah, we just, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we.
I know you fixed
Yeah.
clean. I wasn't sure if you'd fix
Yeah,
the
we
other one.
we did fix that in the red line too, but Aaron knows to do that. So shall we talk about that?
That looks good to me.
Wow. I'm going to take and run with that. Is that okay? Okay.
I do have a question, sorry.
Sure.
And it's something that Alyssa brought up last time, of providing too much information. Like, what's the, and I don't know, I'm not saying you were saying about this particular item, but at the point of initial counseling, this is a lot of information about if my loan converts.
Mm-hmm.
And is that the appropriate time for that, all that information to be provided? Is that being heard by
retroactively?
I think we have it all the way through. Is there anybody that disagrees with striking this piece here?
My hesitance is that in my conversations with Teach Grant recipients, once they have graduated, they refer to the initial entrance counseling first, often, where they're looking at the agreement to serve and they're looking at this and they don't always get to the exit counseling, or they get to some combination of the 3. And so because of that, I would want the information offered to be relatively consistent across the 3 documents.
I think we will lose effectiveness. And likewise, I would suggest taking certain pieces out of conversion counseling and out of exit counseling that are no longer as relevant.
Right. I guess it depends how we view the function of the different pieces. And so I see the agreement to serve as a place where I would hope that the folks that you're thinking of and talking to and working with, I think that's almost like an MPN sort of getting at, you know, the number of requirements here or there and the different components. And that's why I think it's helpful as we start from now on with counseling and thinking about conversion and all of that to keep our timeline in check as we think about, you know, what pieces go in which space to ensure that we're not overburdening and yeah.
So what about the student who has had initial counseling without this, but then decides that they really do want to not teach or whatever? Wouldn't that be something to consider also?
They would, I'm only suggesting to take it out of entrance, not.
Yes. The initial, yes, that's what I'm asking a question of specifically to initial.
Yeah, so I think that would still be okay not to have it in initial, as long as it was elsewhere in the counseling process.
And we also have the addition of the annual notice. Is this language, I haven't gotten there yet. Yeah, right. So, you know, I don't know if that was included there.
I'm
as
just
well.
asking only because if they don't ever have subsequent counseling, then they don't have this piece. That's the reason I asked.
I'm not sure it should be in subsequent counseling either. I think it needs to be present at the point in time in which they are leaving a Teach Grant eligible program or deciding that they're not going to teach.
I could just thought here, what about the students who may decide while they're still in school that I don't want to teach. I think that's what Sophia's, so maybe there would be some benefit to pointing this out to people up front. So that while
In that case, there probably would, because they wouldn't receive it until exit.
Right.
So.
Right, that's what I'm asking now. I didn't realize.
I think without another way to capture those other students, they do need the information, but I have to go back to that. I don't think it's going to be effective. There's so much now in the entrance.
I don't know if we need to repeat the same exact language, but I do think we have to refer to it because we have a lot of what we don't want is candidates to get to the exit and then feel like they have to finish and fulfill the obligation, but they really don't want to teach, right? They really don't have the interest. But they are now obligated because they did not understand this piece at the beginning. So hopefully we can deter people from feeling like that and going into the teaching profession for the wrong reason.
Anyone else on this?
So maybe, because I was sort of presenting as the whole thing should go away from initial counseling, maybe instead, well, as it's in the red line now, the first 8 would stay. The second 8, that's yellow. Yeah. That really, you know, A and B, that really is part of conversion counseling. So maybe that should be stricken from this portion, but leave the first 8 that explain that to avoid further blah, blah, blah.
I totally agree, David. Yeah.
So this is before we look at your conversion counseling language, right? So systematically, so shall we for now say that we're going to keep 8 as is? And before we strike the other 8, to look over and see how this all fits with the conversion counseling? Does that make sense? We have language from Alyssa on conversion counseling, which, did we give that out yet or not? I don't
But I thought the point of getting rid of this language here was so as not to overwhelm the students with information that's not necessarily relevant for them at the moment, but then referring to the second 8 highlighted in yellow.
Oh, the second 8 highlighted in yellow is, I thought we were going to talk about that as with in relationship to conversion counseling, which is why I was trying to find my, here it is.
Go through the other level of counseling first.
Aren't we just
Yeah,
still
so
in
we're still in
initial?
entrance, yeah.
Right,
Still in
right.
initial,
But so the question is the second 8, the yellowed 8.
Yeah.
Is that part of the conversion counseling?
I don't believe that exact verbiage is in there.
Okay.
But we could easily add it.
And is that where everybody, do we agree with David that that's where?
I think that's
most-
where it's more appropriate.
Any dissenters?
I mean, this presumes that the grants will not convert while the student is still in school, that the servicer errors are addressed. I mean, my only hesitancy in taking it out is the history of all of the mistakes by the servicers, you know, and the risk that you have is that if a student doesn't know that a grant that's converted to a loan can be reconverted back, FedLoan or whichever other servicer is servicing the grant program makes an error, then they have no idea that they have recourse.
We're talking about the second 8, not the
Yeah.
first 8.
Yeah,
the
I'm talking about
first
the
8.
second 8.
But the second 8 doesn't talk about, I mean, it's mentioned in the previous one as well.
And if
Or no,
their
it's not. I
grant
see
was
what you're saying.
converted, no matter when their grant was converted, they would then at that time receive conversion counseling, which would say
okay.
this.
And I assume all of these documents would also be posted on the financial student aid website, the initial counseling, the exit counseling, conversion counseling,
And subsequent?
and subsequent counseling, as well as all the forms, or now a singular.
I would also say regarding
I would
conversion.
check with you for what we publish on your form, on your website.
Yeah, the counseling is there now, but I think to actually complete it, you have to log in, but it is there. But I think you can kind of see a demo of it without logging in. Yeah.
We also have the language, if you think about conversion, we have right now, I believe it's still there though, again, I haven't gotten there yet, but the 90 to 120 days. So there would be a notification at that point as well before conversion too. So we're talking about servicer error. So the way we're,
I just heard quietly saying something about you can maybe demo them without logging in. I think that if we have a say, why don't we just have them open?
It may be worth adding a subsection at the end of the counseling that all the counseling will be publicly available on the department's website, and that way we can just make sure that that is a continuing obligation.
It's nice even just for administrators to be able to go and take it so that we know what our students are receiving.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure you can see, I don't see that there would be an issue with providing kind of a version of it that you could look at without logging in, but if you're going to get credit for it, because then you have to log in. So, but I think you're
Agreed.
just asking, make it also available so that anybody could go in there and
If
see.
parents, administrators, curious students.
I have a quick question. So not having had a teach grant, to log in to watch the counseling means you've already accepted the teach grant? Is that correct? For the counseling?
But you would never be, your teach grant, you could be awarded a teach grant and it could sit out there as a pending award, but until you complete that counseling, we can't pay it.
Right. So yes, that's what I'm saying is you do the counseling once you've already accepted.
Well,
Log in
again,
and
at my,
see it.
it's different. At my school,
Okay, well, if you're-
I require them to do the counseling along with the application that they have to do at my school.
So with the intent to accept the funds. But all I was thinking is it really should be out there so that even if you're not sure, you can see what it's all about. So I think it would be really good. That's why I was just trying to understand process-wise.
And even after you have done the counseling and the school disperses the teach grant, you still have the right to cancel it if you don't want it. So,
And we have to notify you of that, right?
that's right.
Is that in the initial? No.
So do we want to just make a note where the yellow is that we will include that as part of conversion counseling? For the yellow?
Does that cover what you wanted to say, David? It says, sorry, it says strike, am I loud enough? It says strike, highlighted, 8 and a big A and B here, and ensure that language is in conversion counseling. Okay.
Let's continue with finishing the initial counseling. The other pieces here are what was there before. There's no change to that. So I don't know if there's anything else that we need to talk about with the initial counseling. But I'll give everybody a moment to.
I am going to say the one thing. I'm not sure you're going to love this idea, but do we want to inform the recipient at the initial counseling that there is the availability of service suspension? I guess not. It's not at that point because they still have to finish their program. Okay, never mind.
Okay. So shall we move on to subsequent then? Is that, all right. So in subsequent counseling, we did several things here, and this will be reflected in the red line, where we reworded but kept the concept under III that the circumstances under point 34 under which a teach grants will be converted to a loan, including an explanation that if the grant recipient requests that a teach grant be converted to a direct unsubsidized loan in accordance with point 43, the conversion of the grant to a loan cannot be reversed. And then 4, Romanet 4, explain that to avoid further accrual of interest as described in 612 of this section, a grant recipient who decides not to teach in a qualified school or field or for any other reason no longer intends. This is the same thing we just discussed before. Then we move on to say that we emphasize that once a teach grant is converted, it may be reconverted to a grant only if, and again, that's that same language that we just said we wanted to put in conversion counseling. So I'm assuming we want to do the same here. Okay, so we will just strike it from here, and so this is A again, 4A and B. It's the same as the other in the yellow highlight above. Okay. Anything else on, we did some renumbering, you can see that. Anything else on subsequent? Exit. So I think the discussion here, or we talked about exit counseling, we have a little note here, group inform students of bill created in 686.43, and so we wanted to note here that from our perspective, the exit counseling will explain during a service period, the secretary will send the recipient information as described. We wouldn't regulate a bill or anything else here. that's just to make that point clear. And then we go down to, there's a lot here on exit counseling. My question would be, is it easier to view all of this in the clean document rather than the red line strike? Or you feel okay about this, doesn't matter? Yeah, I think, well, because it just gets messy down there. Initially, it's not bad, but then you turn a page and it's like, it's a lot here. So I think right off the top, we talk about the high need fields in where we have red line anyway. In 686.2, be a high need field that is listed in a nationwide list for the state in which the grant recipient teaches at the time the grant recipient begins teaching in that field, even if that field subsequently loses its high need designation for the state, or for the teaching service performed on or after July 1, 2010. This was the same language as before.
So we're going to strike the sentence after
However, the however language again. It's the same. So we want to, yeah. Then we again have the language about emphasize the grant recipient fails or refuses to complete the service obligation. My question would be, what do we want to do with that, Alyssa? Does that belong here as well?
Thank you.
Yes, that's okay. Take your time.
I'm open to discussion. I'm not sure if it's here or not. My answer is I don't know. There's a lot of important information at exit. They're not at conversion yet, so I would tend to say no. I'm thinking out loud. And we do talk about voluntary conversion here, which is different, and we probably want the focus to be on voluntary conversion at this point, and probably save all of the stuff about involuntary until the 90, 120, and the conversion point. That's my just thinking out loud.
I think we're being redundant, but I think we have to get them to think about at least conversion. And so I think when you talk about the voluntary conversion, that will get them to ask the right questions or ask other questions. And so I think as long as we keep some information regarding conversion, we're in good shape.
So I'm a little confused. Are you suggesting to take out the language related to involuntary conversion?
No.
Or the voluntary, or we're keeping
We're on Roman at 5.
Or further up the page.
emphasize, okay. So we're emphasizing the consequences of not fulfilling the service requirement in this section on Roman at 5. And there's a question as to whether or not we would take that language out? Involuntary?
Well, yes, all of that, whether that should be here or not, yes.
So I do think we do have to remind the student that they have to fulfill the service obligation or face involuntary conversion at exit counseling.
Yes, I think that should stay in there.
Okay.
So 5, Roman at 5, A and B will stay.
Yes.
In this case. I think we had said that this should be in here as well. That was our comment here.
I assumed we were talking about the same language that we've struck in other places.
That's what I thought too.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I
Which
see.
is-
Okay,
which is
yeah, I was looking at
actually-
5, sorry.
Yeah, no, all the
Which
different
was the
versions are-
emphasis,
No, I
right?
know. It also is looking kind of the same. It
Yeah.
really does.
Yeah.
You strike it
How could you
however-
even be
however-
confused? How is that possible?
Which is the emphasis, right?
That is listed here, I guess, as 9.
Right.
9 A and B, not 5 A and B. So with 9 A and B, I agree with Alyssa that I think that's okay to remove here again as well.
Because we're telling them everything they need to know at exit, that if you know you're not going to complete your service, then you might want to consider converting now.
Oh, so you're saying keep the voluntary conversion language
Yeah,
at exit.
voluntary conversion at
Yes.
exit, absolutely.
Yes.
So let me just be
I
clear.
feel like we all need
wanna
to take a
keep-
deep breath for a second, because we're
Yeah.
bouncing all over the page.
But removing that same stuff we just removed from entrance and subsequent.
So that's 9, Roman at
Yes.
9. That's just going to be in conversion.
Right. To me, that makes the most sense.
Okay.
So let's start with that again. Are we all? Oops,
I
are
see.
we all?
So 9 is a duplication of what's already explained and okay.
Yes, so it's
then
being redundant.
absolutely. I was like, as long as we're keeping it somewhere. I was like, if it doesn't make it in, that's a
Well,
problem.
actually, I think voluntary conversion is one of the most important things to highlight
Yeah.
at exit time.
yeah, totally.
So we're just removing. I'm sorry. So we're just removing 9, and that's part of the conversion.
That was my.
Roman at 9. Sorry. A and B.
I see. Okay, so then 9 is talking about the reconversion process and the dispute resolution process and whether or not that is available.
Which we haven't talked to about the conversion yet. That'll be
Which
the
we
next
haven't,
one.
yeah.
But
And
we're
so,
just trying to get through this first.
okay.
So Roman at 9 is the one that is going to be struck because that's going to be part of conversion. But but Roman at 5, right? We're keeping.
Yes. But I also, I'm not sure that I'm 100% on board with taking that out yet, so let me think about it. So I just want that noted that
9
I
again? We're back
yeah,
to
that 9 I'm not sure that I'm
So
at.
let's not take it out yet.
Just because in a dispute resolution process, I would want to make them aware that if if their grant is converted, if their service year form is rejected, that there are a number of things that are encompassed within the dispute resolution process where they have the ability to raise it later, and I would want them to know that at the point of exiting, because presumably they could face wrongful conversion relatively early.
But you wouldn't be able to have your grant converted hypothetically, and we haven't gotten again to the actual conversion language, but I would strongly suggest that a conversion could only happen under the condition that there were annual notices, but in particular the 90 to 120 day notice before conversion, that your grant could not be converted without that notice.
Would you want to let, so my thought behind that is that you'd want to let the recipient know that they would need to keep evidence of service years, et cetera, in the event that they need to appeal later.
Is that what this is saying?
That is not what this is saying.
I don't think a student would think that. If I tell them, oh, you can appeal later, a student isn't going to think, well, then I should save all of this evidence. Like, I see where you're coming from,
Yeah.
but it's not going to connect any dots for students.
Okay. So maybe adding additional language just related to preserving evidence of service years, et cetera, once they begin teaching. I mean, especially if
If we're going to do that, then that, in my opinion, needs to be at entrance.
at entrance as well.
I would think. Because they could be fulfilling service years while doing their master's degree and all of this other, and using teach grants. So if we're going to notify a student that they should be keeping records of all of their teaching service, then that sort of change, and then I think we need to start that at entrance, the point of entrance. Just my thoughts.
But I think what we were trying to do is not overwhelm them with information that they weren't yet ready to process and couldn't really, what you said, connect the dots to yet. And so that was why I was saying we've already said that there is a conversion that can and will occur. taking out this particular language for later would benefit in making sure that we are streamlining this to making sure that the candidates understand what exactly they're getting into without necessarily going into the details.
Right, but the problem that she brings up, the fact that the student may, if we want to educate them to the fact that they may need evidence, then, and it's especially common at the graduate level, that they're working on a master's degree, using Teach Grant and fulfilling their undergraduate Teach Grant obligation, then that becomes important at entrance. So if we're trying to fix the problem that you bring up, I don't think we need to talk about conversion necessarily, but potentially the fact that they may want to keep that documentation.
Yeah, that's fair.
So maybe we make it an emphasis for entrance. I don't know if we want to do this, but it seems like it's most effective and important at the entrance of graduate.
I hate to make them different.
Yeah, I
we like to
know.
keep them, keep consistent. But yes, to your point, it is maybe even only important at the graduate level. Well, that's not true.
But I think we're also
be a reality.
worrying
I
about.
think that's-
I think we're also worrying if they need additional documentation that's going to come from the district. They can request that information. The district has to keep those records, and so I think we're really worrying about something that will fall primarily on the districts, not
I
on
mean,
them.
that is true if you're talking about public school teachers. If you're talking about charter school teachers, they come up and die very quickly, and sometimes the whole school system will dissipate, and then there are no records. So you can't request a contract, nothing.
But you would be able to prove employment in some, if this was this whole giant dispute process, I don't know. Basically, my hesitation here in including language at any point is just that, like, if the federal government is terrible and they don't do XYZ things, you should make sure you have all, like, I just, like, I see where you're coming from 100%, and I am very concerned about wrongful conversions. I think we all are, and that's a big part of why we're all here, and why this subcommittee was convened. I'm just not sure that, sort of turning on the siren about, well, who knows what may happen, keep everything in hard copy under your mattress. Like, if we, where we draw the line in terms of information we provide without being overburdensome and slowing down the process.
And again, back to my original point, has everybody done entrance counseling? I think go do it. It's lengthy, and it's
I've
a
looked
lot.
at it.
It's a lot.
As I was thinking about this too, aren't they submitting their documentation electronically? Am I correct here? Not having been a Teach Grant recipient.
No, they're sending in paper copies.
Well, maybe we want to look at the process too, because if you're
Wait,
submitting
are we
an
talking
elect-
about, because entrance is done electronically for most schools.
No,
I mean,
I'm
I
talking
do it
about
in person sometimes.
submitting documentation of service, meeting the service requirement. Because I was just trying to think about if you are submitting electronically.
So then maybe we say on that form, retain a copy for your own records.
It's a way to do it, yeah. Be sure to retain a copy for your own records. Whether it's electronic or hard copy, I mean, I think just putting that there as a point of emphasis, and we'll be able to give feedback to the department as well in this process about their documents. So that may be a point of emphasis for all of us to make when we respond.
I'll also say I am willing actually to take out 9, and I think I'm gonna stay my comments on the evidence, because that may be better placed in the annual notifications each year that they're going to receive anyway. So, yes.
While you guys were chatting, just to recap, I think
Sure. So while you guys were discussing, I am actually okay with striking the section that we were just discussing, 9, A and B, and preserving my concerns about having evidence for appeals for the annual notification the department will provide to recipients.
Just to be clear, are you saying that that should be in regulation?
That should be in regulation related to the annual emails that the department will send out to recipients.
I'm trying to think, where is that?
I think that's at the end of 43, the way it's currently
All right,
organized.
so when we get there, let's pull that back up again, so we don't lose that. Yeah.
And then maybe we can jump back up to 5 since we took a detour.
Yes, sorry about that. All right, back to 5. Is everybody okay with 5, Romanet 5? I'm going to assume that it's okay. 6, explain to the grant recipient that the secretary will, at least annually during the service obligation period, send the recipient the notice described in point 43. And 7, explain the circumstances as described in point 43 under which a teach grant will be converted to a direct and subsidized loan, including an explanation that if the grant recipient requests that the teach grant be converted to a direct and subsidized loan, the conversion cannot be reversed. And then 8, Romanet 8, explain that to avoid further accrual, a grant recipient decides not to teach. We've seen this language before. They request that the secretary convert their teach grant to an unsubsidized loan that the grant recipient may begin repaying immediately instead of waiting. Okay. Then we had the 9 we just discussed and agreed to strike. We will have to renumber, we know, but for the sake of the millions of things here, the rest of them will not, we did not do anything to, except for 2 things I want to note here. One, which there was a placeholder here for a process determining the loan being converted in error to the group to discuss, and in actuality, we are saying that the secretary determines the error. So I don't think we need to add any more there. We've said that throughout the documents. And then here, there was some question from the group about describing the process. Was there additional information needed to describe the process? And if so, our feeling was, you would need to think of some language, because if there's an error, the documentation would be provided to Ed. So we weren't sure what else would even be necessary there. And it may be that nothing is necessary there, but. I guess nobody thinks that we need to do anything.
So maybe we could just talk a little bit further. So this is all
Exit
part
counseling.
of exit counseling,
Yeah.
and we're going through available repayment options, debt management strategies, likely consequences of default, going through deferment and forbearance options, all these sorts of things. Is that how it is? That's existing, right? That's what you were saying.
Yes, anything that we don't have.
Right.
It's just in regular language. Regular on was already there.
How important does the group feel that public service loan forgiveness is important at this point? I have it in the conversion language, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on including it here as well? Because I don't want to say most, some of the students who have their loans convert would potentially qualify for that.
I also think teacher loan forgiveness. Many of the, is it in here?
It's yes.
Oh, I missed it.
I read it somewhere. Yes.
Okay. I think PSLF, that many of them would be eligible. So yeah, I think that'd be worth informing, just like teacher loan forgiveness is worth informing them of.
I'm not sure that it matters as long as it's in here.
I'm just trying to think through how much about loan repayment we want to include in this spot.
That was actually going to be one of my questions. Is this
That's why I
too
threw it out there.
much?
Because I really think at exit it does need to focus on the agreement to serve and how to fulfill that and the length of time.
This seems like it would possibly, it would just be making it more complicated, but if the student has opted for early conversion,
Then there's conversion counseling.
Then
They
they
would still
get
get the
conf-
conversion counseling, and
okay, so
PSLF is in there unless we decide to take it out.
Which, and I strongly believe that, and I think the group agreed last time as well, that at the point of conversion, or if there is indication that conversion is what the grant recipient is interested in, is to provide almost full, if not full, loan counseling, because hypothetically, the grant recipient may not have ever had a loan and may not be familiar with all these things. It's just a matter of, to me, as I'm thinking about it now, as we think about it holistically, and I think we've done a good job of adding some other touch points along the way. I'm just thinking about all of these loan pieces because these are complicated concepts. I mean, you know.
in this list of things that already currently exist, perhaps keeping in explain to the grant recipient how to contact the secretary, because that's a touch point that's probably rather important even in the pursuit of completing the obligation.
Yeah, debt management strategies, are those important right now?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
No,
Deb.
go ahead, go ahead.
They're going to have to go through secondary counseling if they have other loans anyway. This is to
And that is
supplement what they're
if
already
they have
receiving.
loans, yes,
Yeah,
it's all in
exactly.
So I'm wondering if what I'm hearing, you guys tell me if I'm right, is that maybe we get rid of a lot of this stuff in the exit counseling, perhaps with the exception of how to contact the secretary, and shift that into conversion counseling if it's not already there? Is that?
Yes, I agree with that. I think one thing that I would also like to keep is and I'm open to conversation here, but I think it would be helpful, is the anticipated monthly repayment amount. I don't know. Could go either way on that. But all the other ones, I'm definitely more on the leaning towards the side of.
I will
scratching,
say it's an average anticipated monthly repayment amount, which, what's that going to mean to the student? No, nothing.
Yeah, they don't have a job yet to know how good or bad that could be, right? Or maybe they do.
And it's
but
not their number anyway.
Talking about specifically looking at Romanet, I guess it's, 10 and above, and going through and figuring out what stays and what goes. Maybe we should that might be the easier way to.
I think it's all of them except 13 goes, right?
I just want to push back a little bit on the average anticipated monthly repayment, and this is just because I did speak to a recipient who, in deciding whether or not to convert, was wondering about what the average repayment and the average interest accrual was. And so even if it's not theirs, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is not the appropriate way to do it either. But I do wonder if we can have some sort of statistic about the interest.
If they are a regular loan user, they get that information. If they are a Teach Grant user, that number is going to be higher because the aggregate Teach isn't as high as the aggregate student loan. So they would be provided with an artificially higher actually amount if they were only a Teach Grant user, and potentially a lower on average amount if they used both, potentially. Because you can't actually get into a situation where you've exceeded your aggregate upon conversion.
Sure.
So wouldn't that come up in conversion counseling? And if they're electing to early convert, would that be part would we shift it there?
Conversion counseling, I think, because we actually worked on it together, though briefly, but I think it does have their student-specific amount in it. So it will be much more helpful.
And if they're not sure about early conversion, they could still go through conversion counseling and then make a decision. Am I clear on that?
They've agreed to leave it open, although I would think that you would need to log in order to grab your specific amount. That's currently that's how exit counseling works to get your specific loan amount. So they would actually have to log in and not use the forward-facing general conversion counseling.
And so the recommendation is to strike everything from 10 down, but keeping 13?
I think yes, and one more point is that a student who is doing their due diligence and they take regular loan exit counseling and then they take teach grant exit counseling, this stuff is they're going to be like, I just did this, click, click, I just did this, click, 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 and then they're not going to be getting to the important pieces anyway. So I think to the extent with which we can lean it down, it won't feel the same and it may be more impactful.
I'm guessing that there's not much for 5 or 6. It's the same language that we had from a million years ago.
Hold on one second, though.
Oh.
I'm going to throw a wrench in the works. I apologize.
Oh,
but not a big
please,
one.
please
Not a
do.
big one. Maybe we keep in there that the teacher loan forgiveness and PSLF, if we're focusing on things that they might not get in other counseling. Do you want to at least mention those? I don't know.
Those are in regular exit counseling?
They are there?
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. Then never mind. Wrench removed.
When we talk about conversion, or do you want to talk about it as part of counseling? Which way do you want to do it?
Whatever the group wants to do.
I think it'd be great to see it now because then we'll see the whole.
And there's already some
continuous
things that need
counseling.
added anyway because the pieces that we struck, I'm not sure that they're in there, or at least not explicitly like that. So maybe now is good.
So let me just, I need Aaron to pull up the copy on the. And then, does everybody have a hard copy of the conversion? Okay.
I don't have one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then, once Aaron returns, we will have you walk us through what y'all did. Where were you envisioning this as part of counseling or
I was going to ask you guys that. Should this be within Teach or should it be? I guess should this be within within the counts? So we have entrance, subsequent exit, conversion, or should it be with the conversion stuff? What do you guys?
So wait a second though, because D compliance pertains to all of the above counseling, which would be conducted by the institution. This counseling would be.
Not the institution.
No, this exactly. So we would actually need to keep compliance where it is and make this
Okay.
E.
Sorry.
Well, it actually says. Sorry, it actually says compliance with this section, so it kind of throws me to have something right after it and not consider it part of the section.
And just so you guys are aware, the very last thing that this says is documentation must be maintained to substitute compliance with a section for each converted borrower. So that piece is within this verbiage already.
Okay. So I think I retract my recommendation and not put it in the counseling because of the whole compliance requirement for under this section. I think we need to think of putting it somewhere else or creating its own, make it be its own section.
That's a good point because one obligation is on the institution and this is a separate obligation on the secretary, essentially.
I mean, we can also clarify within D that the institution must maintain documentation substantiating the institution's compliance with sections A through C for each teach grant recipient.
Right, and so on the second page there, number 3, I don't like ordering the secretary around. So rather than saying the institution will maintain document, I just said documentation must be maintained. So if we need to change that to say the secretary must maintain document, then we can. I just wanted to make sure to highlight this was not an institutional requirement, but wasn't exactly sure how to arrive at that.
I don't think the secretary would have an obligation to maintain. I mean, I understand why the institutions do because of your program participation agreement, right? You have to demonstrate that you're complying with Title IV and the HEA. But the secretary doesn't have any obligation to do so, so they wouldn't need to keep documentation.
So maybe it needs to specifically say the servicer, because I think we would want the servicer to maintain something.
To demonstrate that they provided the information.
Conversion
to the-
counseling, yeah. Otherwise,
I'm trying to speak to the business and service.
Well, there's a kind of a general question at the beginning that, like, this would be, I think, electronic counseling that we provide, and I think that's pretty straightforward. But like loan exit counseling, as you know, there is really no way to enforce exit counseling. What the regulations say is that the institution has to tell the borrower about the exit counseling and how to complete it. If they don't complete it, then you have to send them written counseling materials. But the reality is that if a borrower just blows it off entirely, it's not like entrance counseling where if you're a first-time borrower, if you don't complete it, you don't get your loan money. So I think there's a similar issue here. We can tell them when it converts that you've got to complete, that you should complete this conversion counseling, and if they don't do it, we could model it on the loan counseling regulations and say then we would mail them stuff, but we can't enforce it. So
right, and
so at the end it says we have to maintain document to substantiate compliance, but we can't. But if this is all electronic, then there's going to be a record that someone did it.
To
or
that
that
point,
we sent the information. So that's
Right.
just automatically going to happen.
So I thought a lot about number 1, and it does say by interactive electronic means and by mailing written counseling. That was put in there intentionally. We can change it if we want to, but the reason that was put in there intentionally is because having the material given to the student in this case, I think, is very important. For one thing, I would say they probably won't remember how to log in at the point of conversion. Not to pick on you guys, but resetting your FSA ID user password and PIN is a nightmare. And I know you've made improvements, and we thank you for those. But actually mailing, I can't tell you enough how important I think it will be to actually mail them the information. I think it will be invaluable to the students at that point. I mean, this could be 6, 8, 10 years from the last time they even used their ID and password, maybe, especially if they were only a grant user and not a loan user, because they would have no reason to be accessing NSLDS or doing a FAFSA any longer. That information is just not going to be there for them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We don't have any way of knowing what kind of volume there is, but there could be some cost issues on our end for mailing materials out. But again, the volume is probably not going to be a really large number. It's not like mailing it out for every student loan borrower. So that may not be an issue. But I just wanted to point out that we really can't do anything but tell them complete this counseling. If they don't complete it, and again, as far as the documentation, that's going to just happen automatically, either by documentation that they logged in and completed it, or documentation and that we mailed the counseling out. So.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with saying that you don't want any documentation to be maintained. If I had to pick my battle, so to speak, I would rather kind of land on the spot where you're going to mail it to them as well. I do think it will be difficult, though, if a student says, I never received conversion counseling, and then all the servicer can say is, yes, you did, we mailed it to you, without having some type of proof of that.
I mean, that wouldn't have any legal effect. It's not as though the borrower could raise that as a defense against the servicer to say that there was never a loan contract. So that's why I'm like, in terms of the documentation, because it wouldn't bring up a contract issue.
That's a good point.
You know.
Oh, sure. Yes. So, essentially, this just tried to focus on what would be important at the time of conversion. And so, we do have inform the borrower of average anticipated based on the borrower's indebtedness, which I think is important because that personalizes it. And if they are logging into the online site, that would be very easy to achieve. Again, they have to now be educated on the different repayment plan options. They're all listed there, and different features as well as the interest paid under each plan, which is very similar to what exit counseling goes through now. The reason that that's sort of duplicative of exit is because we don't know if they've ever been a borrower. So this may be the first time that they are running through this. So it does need to really focus on the loan plans themselves. Explain the options to repay. Explain the difference between a shorter schedule and what that means if they change to a longer repayment plan. Provide information on consolidating, because now this may be something new that the student is thinking about, given that they have other loans, maybe have other loans.
Okay, just if they have other loans, but if you're talking about, because I was just going to ask why you were focusing on consolidation, because if all somebody has are direct loans, whether they're regular direct loans or these converted, in general, there is no reason that you would want to consolidate it. In fact, it may be to your detriment.
I would agree, but I think giving them the information is important, given the different repayment plan options that they have based on date of consolidation or date of loans taken, which can be different for each student based on when they used loans and even legislation that we don't know yet, potentially. So I do think reminding them that consolidation is an option is important there. Debt management strategies would be important here. I know we removed it elsewhere, but at this point in time, it does become important again. And then public service loan forgiveness is mentioned here, again, because it is important at this point. Reconsideration process for the converted loan. Describe the likely consequences of default. I mean, they're all just sort of loan-esque.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You have the public service loan forgiveness, but wouldn't you also want to include the teacher loan
If it's
forgiveness?
if it's not in here already, yes, we absolutely would.
Okay.
So we can add that
Bless
here
you.
if you want. If it's not, and it may not be anywhere. So we could just say there, explain to the borrower the availability of public service loan forgiveness and teacher loan forgiveness. Yeah.
Can I actually ask a process question related to PSLF and TLF? I've heard from folks who got their grants converted after they had already gotten teacher loan forgiveness granted. What happens? Can they appeal?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the situation. So if you had a really small loan balance, say the converted teach grants were the only direct loans you had, you could conceivably have gotten that entire amount forgiven through teacher loan forgiveness if you're a science teacher. So you don't have any more loan debt. So there's really not much of anything to do there. There's no point in changing your loans back to grants because you've already had them forgiven. But if you had a larger loan balance, then what would happen would be that teacher loan, and we change those loans back to teach grants, then that teacher loan forgiveness would then be reapplied to reduce the balance on your other direct
And I
loans.
think what you were asking is the other way.
Yeah, it's the other way. So a person receives teacher loan forgiveness, maybe, I don't know, let's say year 5, right?
But they had a small loan balance to begin, because teacher loan forgiveness may not cover all of their loans. So let's pretend
Yeah.
it did, and
Yeah.
then
This board is apparently dying, so we're going to convert to the backup audio on the camera, so you can just speak normally.
Okay.
I'm just going to boost that.
Okay. Teacher voice. As we all taught at some point.
Are we good to go?
Yes, I need to turn off that speaker.
Okay. That's the like cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard it too.
I wondered what that was. I was like, who is restless here? Okay, so I am actually raising a different circumstance. So I'm talking about someone who receives teacher loan forgiveness for a small balance and then has their grant convert after they receive the teacher loan forgiveness. Are they supposed to?
Wait, they got teacher loan forgiveness on their, what I call their regular direct loans. And then they have their teach grants converted to direct loans.
Right.
I'm not sure if I understand what you're asking.
So had their grant converted before they received teacher loan forgiveness, their now loan balance on their teach grants would have been included. But because they were not included, they now have to repay that debt on the converted grant. What should those individuals do?
I'm still not sure that I'm understanding
So
So you're saying that you didn't use up your full, say you were a math or science teacher and you qualified for the $70,500 in forgiveness, but you didn't have that much in loan debt, so you didn't get the full benefit of it? You said could you-
Exactly.
I don't know. We've never considered that situation, guys.
There are individuals in that position who I believe have been told by their servicer that that was it. They didn't have the opportunity to reopen teacher loan forgiveness.
That'll be an important clarification if we're to include this in counseling.
Because
Well,
this
but
presumes that they
that's
would
one of
have gotten
those. I think this is another example of a situation that we would address on a case-by-case basis, because this certainly isn't going to be something that's going to be.
Well, then I think even the statement, if you've already achieved teacher loan forgiveness, contact the secretary, or something like that needs to be said, because it is going to be more than a few, I would imagine.
Yes.
So you were looking for some kind of trigger language? No, some kind of trigger language.
Oh.
I forgot.
Good work.
For the student, for the grant recipient to contact somebody in order to find out the most expedient way to manage this.
Maybe.
Is that what we're kind of getting at?
Or what procedure they should follow, because right now they're being directed to go back to FedLoan, and FedLoan is saying you can't do anything about this.
So I guess the point is, if we're going to include information on teacher loan forgiveness, we need to address those people who have already achieved teacher loan forgiveness.
Because this is conversion counseling,
Exactly.
and they're about that alone.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the original intent in the current of telling people about teacher loan forgiveness was the thought that this might be something that would get in the future, that even though your grants got converted, but we're talking about some other situations where, and I don't know that we can write these regulations to cover every one of those.
At my
But if you
school,
wanna just
most
say-
of my students graduate with that. It's actually right around that amount, but that means a significant portion are graduating with less than the teacher loan forgiveness. And we graduate a lot of teachers. So for my population, and I'm not alone, if they achieve teacher loan forgiveness prior to conversion, it's going to be a conundrum for them.
I don't know what we could do other than just say if you have questions, that they can contact the secretary if they have questions about I don't even know how you phrase it, the interplay between teacher loan forgiveness and it's so, I'm not sure.
So
what
ideally, it would
in
happen
mind.
automatically.
Well, but this is also an interesting point for the dispute resolution process, because I had not considered the reconversion of a grant due to a successful application for teacher loan forgiveness. And I would assume if you could get it forgiven anyway, that if you received teacher loan forgiveness during your service period, that you should also be able to get that proportional part of your now loan discharge.
Especially, I hate to throw this out there, but especially for someone who experiences erroneously conversion during that 8-year window and then re-enrolls, they would really want it to be forgiven rather than converted back to a grant, because they would still face potentially conversion later on down the line, given the new concept of reset that we have.
And so maybe we can flag that to discuss in the dispute resolution process, because I hear you that it is a case-by-case situation, but it will be
So
such
it's gonna
a
be a lot of
common case
cases.
by case
Mhm.
that we'll want to define it.
So, did it again. So maybe think about for tomorrow what language to put in there, and we can discuss it some more to see if this makes sense once we see the language.
Can I ask, before we do that, is it possible to have automatic evaluation for teacher loan forgiveness at the time of conversion? What I mean by that is when the servicer is, I have this loan I'm about to convert, or I have this grant that I'm about to convert to a loan. Did this person successfully achieve teacher loan forgiveness? If yes, did they achieve it up to the $17,500? And if no, they've already achieved it. We know that they have. So could that, before we craft verbiage, it would be important to know if at the time of conversion, if that could be an automatic review. Because it would be documented. There's a documented history of loan forgiveness.
Would we necessarily want it to be automatic in the case of someone who's erroneously converted? If it's automatic, then let's say yes, it automatically happens. Okay, this much is wiped out, but then they're going to argue with the secretary
For the remainder, they're still achieving the benefit. In fact, maybe even a larger benefit if they could potentially face conversion later on down the road in the example that I was talking to her about. So I think forgiveness is always the best case.
I understand that, but then the water really does get muddy in terms of how you handle, if we're going to say you automatically get the loan forgiveness portion, then why would that student then argue that, oh no, don't convert. Let's say that it's a nice juicy piece of their teach grant that goes away with this. They might not even then go and argue with the secretary if they only look
Okay.
in a debt class.
If the student feels that that's an okay result to them, then that's an okay result to me.
Well, then I'm not sure we're holding the servicer accountable at that point. If it's an erroneous situation and we talk about holding the servicer accountable for finding the solution that tends to circumvent, I'm just wondering, because it's also, it just seems to me that if we're going to do that, then we really should think carefully about an appeals process. I'd rather make sure there's an appeals process in there and some potential accountability for the servicer rather than this automatic, because yes, and not all of them will necessarily get it because the teacher loan forgiveness is very specific on the subject area, so it's also kind of not necessarily.
No, and I'm not saying that everybody who experiences conversion will have in the past already experienced teacher loan forgiveness, but there will be more than some.
But you're also saying to the moment that they're going to conversion that it's an automatic check with loan forgiveness.
To
And
see
then
if they've
automatically
experienced it before.
an automatic apply of loan forgiveness.
And check,
If
and
they've already-
then do what? I think
I think the check would be
there are so many
automatic
different.
application
Well,
of
you
loan
could certainly go
forgiveness.
in and find out if someone got teacher loan forgiveness, but once you got that, what would you do with that information? It seems to me it would really depend on individual circumstances. I'm not sure what's being
It
suggested.
would. So I guess in lieu of, because they're not allowed to reapply, they've been told this. So if they're not allowed to reapply,
For teacher loan forgiveness, just to.
and it can't be an
But
automatic
to be
look
clear
back.
here, we're talking about people who didn't get the maximum teacher loan forgiveness benefit because they didn't have enough loan debt to use it up. But now they would. And how many, how often?
Well, again, I
is
think
that?
it depends on your institutional profile of student, but for my student population, it would be significant.
But regardless, what would be the process then, right? So
Well, we'd have to go back and talk about it to see if there would be a way to, one of the things, the teacher loan forgiveness, one of the rules is that the loan for which you're seeking forgiveness has to be made before the end of the 5th year of teaching. So, but in this case, you might have to argue that although the loan, which used to be a teach grant, was after that, you could instead, perhaps we could look back at, well, when did you get the teach grant that resulted in that loan? So we would have to take that back and look at it, but I don't think that's something we can spell out in these
Well, then I think we need to change regular exit counseling when it talks about teacher loan forgiveness, where they need to do a consideration if they've used teach grants and this. So, I mean, we're pigeonholing the student depending on their situation, which I don't think is fair.
I mean, also, to your point, I do think, one, if the interest is retroactive and we say that this will be a loan all the way back to the date when it was dispersed, then these are loans that were issued.
There's price because that's how we set the interest rate. So that's something. But again, I think these are cases we would have to look at these on a case by case basis because there's no one size fits all answer.
So if you're willing to look at them on a case by case basis, then why can't it be an automatic look on a case by case basis if they fit the criteria?
But also, it's an algorithmic situation. This is not something where you need the student to submit any additional documentation. This is purely, did they exhaust teacher loan forgiveness, and what do they have left?
About it.
Yeah,
we can
let's-
take that back.
So, but and I think until we know procedurally how it's going to work, we can't have. How would I write
Right.
that?
So for now, let's put something there that says that we will consider what is possible here for trigger eventuses, or I'm not really sure what I call it.
You know, and looking at this again, I think I probably thought teacher forgiveness was under partial forgiveness or discharge, but we can make it specific. I probably should.
To be clear, I think if we were to look at NSLBS to see if someone had gotten teacher loan forgiveness, I don't know that that's necessarily something that we could put in these regulations.
No, but it could mention that if you experience teacher loan forgiveness, so, I mean, there could be some verbiage there. We have to address it. I mean, we can't just.
Well, what would you say?
If it's going to be an automatic look back,
Well, I mean, you're proposing,
Then I wouldn't
but I
mention
think if we said something here, what would we say that you should do? You as the teacher, what would we say?
so in general, I do think it needs to highlight that there is such a thing as teacher loan forgiveness, and probably instruct them on where to go to apply, just like it does for public service loan forgiveness. And I think there should be something in, it doesn't have to be in here, but in the actual conversion counseling itself, because not every, we don't write out what's told to students, but there should be a section in there about teacher loan forgiveness and how it would work if you've already achieved teacher loan forgiveness. But it doesn't need to be spelled out here.
Is it possible? Is it possible that one can get teacher loan forgiveness?
Because if it's not, then that does need to be in here. If
And
you've already
I'm
received
just saying
teacher loan
it-
forgiveness, you cannot apply again.
Or,
We were talking about the how often it occurred. I'm just trying to understand, is it possible that one, at the point of conversion, that that it is an opportunity that they could go back and participate in the loan forgiveness?
What do you mean? I mean, you can go back.
But the question, I mean, if it's not possible at all, I mean, then this is moot. But if it's possible at all, when we're talking about conversion counseling, and we're talking about the borrowers and the availability of the loan forgiveness, if it's public service loan forgiveness, then is there an opportunity for them to participate in the teach loan forgiveness program?
Teacher loan forgiveness?
The teacher loan forgiveness program.
Yeah, you can, if you get your teach grants, and that was the original intent of this, was that if your teach grants are converted to loans, let's assume it was a proper conversion, that you may still be able to get some benefit through the teacher loan forgiveness program. But we're talking about some more complicated situations here where maybe people had already gotten teacher loan forgiveness and then they had their grants converted. I'm not sure that I understand that.
Well, I'm just trying to make sure that if it's still possible even afterwards, even if it's a small group, then we need to be able to make sure that
Well,
we have
I'm
it
still not
part
sure
of the
that I mean, I think the question that Kira asked would be about a situation where someone had a relatively small loan balance. they taught for 5 consecutive years in a low-income school, and they were a math or science teacher or special ed teacher, so they qualified for up to $70,500, but say their loan balance was only $10,000. So they got the whole $10,000 written off, but then they had $60,000 in teach grants converted to loans at some later point. I think the question is, can they go back and get the remaining portion of that $17,500 applied to reduce those teach grants?
Right. And I'm
That's
asking.
something that can look, well, that, as I said, we need to go back and look at that, but I don't think we spell all of that out in the regulations because there are just too many different
But I do
scenarios.
think it's important that if they cannot reapply, that they should be notified at conversion
Right.
council that they cannot apply. And that was the point that she was bringing up.
Well, then you get into another thing, I think, where would those rules be here, or would they be in the teacher loan forgiveness regulations?
They would be here because it relates to the administration of the teacher.
And it directly
Teaching
impacts
and
But they
program,
also,
exactly.
and they're also, I think you also have to look at some of the teacher loan forgiveness requirements too, so it's complicated.
But the
we
second-
can't do that, but we can look at this. So
Well, the secondary question as well is when could we say in these regulations that for the purpose of the teacher loan forgiveness program, that these grants will be considered loans at the time when the person applies, so that it could be included within that amount. Without converting them, so they will just be considered as a loan at the time that a grant recipient applies for teacher loan forgiveness, period. And that way, regardless of the time of conversion, the teach grant amount would still be considered within that
We already
forgiveness.
do that for certain other purposes that are they're spelled out in the agreement to serve, so there's already some precedent for that, so we can talk about that.
That's the whole reason why they can do the interest rate.
Like the interest rate is, if your grants are converted, the interest rate is the rate that was in effect for direct unsubsidized loans that were made at the same time you got your teach grants, which is
Exactly.
basically that same
Exactly.
principle.
And then that would address this issue of, then we would just make that clear, that when you apply for teacher loan forgiveness, your teach grant amount will be considered in
Which
the
is
amount that
essentially
you
what I was
forgiven. Yeah,
asking.
which is, yeah.
I get the idea, we can talk about this concept.
So I'm looking at the time. And I'm thinking maybe we should stop, only because we only have about 10 minutes left. Tomorrow, we would start then with Roman 6.
And where did we ultimately land on where we were putting this at? Or we didn't land?
We didn't land. I'm still of a mindset that it might deserve its own section, but that's just me. So
we would just definitely have to put it above the comment, or below the comment about compliance with this section, because we do want those other pieces to remain an institutional obligation, but we don't for this.
right, that's what I was saying. If we create another section, that wouldn't be an issue at all.
Right. But we can still keep it flowing after the other
It
council.
could be the very next section.
So we just have conversion council.
Yeah.
And just let it be its own section.
But is that weird to do that before we talk about conversion?
Yeah, I think we probably want to.
Maybe we make it its own section somewhere else.
That's what I think she's.
Conversion, yeah.
Yeah.
I think otherwise we're talking about something that isn't even defined.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
think, yeah, we need to be a little bit holistic about it and maybe come back to it when it.
Maybe talk about it now, but then insert it in an appropriate place.
Yes, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yep.
We've done a lot today. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there. We have language still also from Kira that we did not address, but we haven't gotten to the pieces yet.
Yeah.
And then we have the rest of our initial run through to number two run through. Once we've done all of that, then I'm hoping we'll have time to run through and just make sure that, if there's any other additional questions, we can, revisit those if there are any. If there are not any, then we would want to talk about, next week. That's how I kind of see this. Hopefully, we can actually do this this way.
Listen to you on the web.
Pardon?
I'm hearing you like 15 seconds of play.
Oh, okay.
So are you?
We're gonna finish for today.
Okay.
So yeah, you can turn. Thank you very much,
Turn the
everybody.
audio.
Yes. Thank you. Hopefully tomorrow we'll have the other thing back.